Hi there. If you've clicked on this video, chances are you recently picked up Rimworld. You're probably watching your favourite streamer or content creator playing it. Perhaps a friend recommended it to you. After you opened up the Steam page for it and had a mild heart attack at the price of the base game with all of its DLC, you probably just picked up the core game or one of the starter bundles. The only problem is, your game looks totally different to what everybody else seems to be playing, and you don't know what you're supposed to be doing because somehow we're still playing games that rely on text-based tutorials in the 2000s, and who the hell has time for reading? So, like dozens of other games in your Steam library before this, you hit Quit to OS. You've told yourself that you'll get around to learning the game eventually, knowing that you're just going to go and play something else that you already understand. If that scenario sounds familiar to you, don't sweat it. That was me a few years ago, and now I'm closing in on the 4,000 hours played mark. So, in the most parasocial fashion imaginable, what we're going to do in this video is work together. I'm going to help you understand the fundamentals of Rimworld and, most importantly, why things work in certain ways. The in-game tutorial would guide you in setting up a basic home, but it doesn't do a great job at explaining how to take that knowledge and apply it elsewhere. So this isn't going to spoil all of the content for the game or explain every single item to you. That's overkill. It's going to rob you of the joy of discovery that Rimworld has. You might hear me mention things like mental breaks, but I'm not going to list every single one of them, because experiencing certain mental breaks for the first time can be quite interesting. What this play along is going to do is explain all of the core mechanics in much greater detail, and help you understand the game in a practical, hands-on manner, just like how my Twitch chat helped me understand the game when I started all those years ago. Right, let's get started anyway. Move this video over to your second monitor, if you have one, and start up Rimworld. That's if I wasn't already chilling out there anyway. If you're a mobile viewer, prop up your phone next to your PC, console or laptop so that you can play along and pause the video as needed. I'm not going to be using any mods or any DLC, we are raw dogging it with a totally vanilla base game. So hopefully that makes it as clean and straightforward as it can possibly be for you. I've included timestamps for certain chapters and mechanics, so if you are already comfortable with the very basics, like how the UI works, and want to get straight into a play-along tutorial for the game, you can skip over some of the early sections. Bear in mind that if you're using the console version of Rimworld, there are going to be some differences for you. The PC version has received more free content via patches, so you may be missing certain parts, but the fundamentals will remain the same. Boring bit first. Let's set up some in-game options really quickly to make sure that it's a little bit easier for you. In gameplay settings, I have maximum number of colonies set to 2, which is purely for certain modded gameplay interactions. You can easily leave this as 1 and the game will play just fine. I keep the game set to pause on letter for major threats, and I have my learning helper turned off. That's going to be my job in this video. In the interface options, I set my UI scale to 1.25 because I'm an old man and it's better for showcasing information when I make videos. You don't need to do this if you're happy with the default UI scale. I'm a Brit, so I put my temperature into Celsius. If you use freedom units, you're going to have to do a few conversions during your playthrough. I will make sure to throw Fahrenheit as text on the screen when it's important though. I keep weapons shown below portraits because it's helpful to know what colonists have equipped, as well as always highlighting characters with silhouettes. If you like to keep yourself on a sensible schedule, I would recommend showing the real-time clock. Rimworld is one of those games that will absolutely eat your free time. It can keep you playing until suddenly you hear birdsong and whoops, it's 5 AM again. I'll also keep visible mood enabled too, which is going to display a more useful background on the top bar for our colonists. Finally, we have the bits for controls. I personally keep screen edge scrolling disabled as well as zoom to mouse off, because the crash zoom style that it uses makes me feel like I want to barf. Remember, draw styles is also a super useful checkbox to keep turned on to make building things just a little bit quicker. That's the boring stuff out of the way, let's make an actual start. Hit new colony, and for the sake of simplicity, we're going to go with a standard crash landed start. Don't sweat the details that are shown here right now, all of this will make much more sense to you after you've actually played the game a little bit. Now we have the choice of AI Storyteller. In this case, we're going to use Cassandra Classic, but let's quickly go over the differences between them. Cassandra is the most stable, steady, and fair of the three storytellers. She will push and pull a little bit while ramping up the challenge at a manageable pace. You'll find that you have a reasonable mix of good and bad events when using her. Phoebe Chillax, however, is a lie with her naming convention. She plays like Cassandra on Valium, so you won't hear anything from the storyteller for an extremely long stretch of time, which is supposed to help you relax. The problem is that when Phoebe snaps out of her daze, she'll hit the big red button in front of her, and now you're dealing with a far bigger threat than you had previously expected, because it's been such a long time since you were last attacked. Whereas Cassandra will send you a more constant reminder that it's time to upgrade your defences or weapons when the raids step up a notch. That just leaves us with Randy Random. You're either going to love or hate Randy. He can give you some years that are back-to-back disasters without giving you a chance to recuperate, or he can seemingly go offline, presenting basically nothing of interest for multiple days in a row. Then when he finally does remember he's supposed to be telling a story for you, he could just give you an injured chicken in a transport pod. Once you get the metronome of Cassandra down, it is nice to switch over to Randy, as he does a better job of keeping you on your toes and presenting more different situations. We're picking Cassandra Classic anyway. I'm going to pick Strive to Survive as my difficulty, which is Rimworld's version of normal. This has the in-game stats and offsets at their base values. For a first time player that wants a little bit of challenge, Adventure Story will be absolutely fine. Community Builder is going to throw minimal threats your way, but still give you some negatives to deal with, and Peaceful will remove all danger entirely. As you would expect, Blood and Dust and Losing is Fun are what you want to pick if you want to be a bit more masochistic. If you want to go really nuts with it, you can use a custom difficulty setting and ramp the challenge even higher, with some of the big content creators regularly doing 500% threat runs. For now, pick either Community Builder, Adventure Story, or Strive to Survive, depending on how brave you're feeling. And let's check Reload Anytime mode. You could do Commitment mode if you really wanted to. I normally do, but for the sake of learning together, it's easier to roll with being able to reload anytime we want. Now we get to the world generation stage. Let's leave everything default here, except for the seed. That way your world is going to end up exactly the same as mine. So if you want to follow this tutorial along to the letter, you could even land on the very same tile as me. I know some people out there work and learn better when they're able to copy a very structured example, so this will help in that regard. I'm going to enter the seed Fox, F-A-W-X, all lowercase, then hit generate. Boom, now we have our world. You can see that there's different faction bases scattered around, as well as there being all different kinds of biomes that we could potentially live in. There's 12 biomes in the base game, 4 that are warm, 3 that are hot, and 5 that are cold. The easiest place to live now, without question, is a temperate forest. It has a nice temperature range, it has lots of plants and material availability, as well as sturdy terrain that we can build on. You can see the progression from easiest to hardest biomes on screen now, with harder biomes offering you a range of challenges, from things like increased illness frequency, a lack of natural resources, harsher temperatures, or unstable flooring that's going to make your building difficult. Of course, certain biomes may combine multiple of these negatives to make for a really miserable experience. Given that we are going for a tutorial here, let's pick a temperate forest with some nice features to explore. There's a tile over here that has a large river, some hills, 3 types of stone, and what is known as a 40-60 growing period. You can see a lot of other information here too. Average rainfall, disease frequency, as well as the upper and lower temperature boundaries. If you click around on the map and look at different areas, you're going to see that all of these change, with average temperature and growing periods dropping the further from the equator you go, meaning certain sites around the centre of the globe have what's known as a year-round growing period. For now though, we actually want to play in a place that has seasons to worry about. So let's hit next and confirm this tile as our starting point. Now comes the part that is going to be different for everybody. Your starting colonists. You can go as deep as you would like with this part, hitting random a whole bunch of times until you get a group that you are really happy with, or you could just press start and roll with the punches. Let's quickly cover some of the things to look out for with your starting colonists, given that you're brand new to the game. Everyone is going to have traits. Some traits are positive, others not so much. A few good ones to keep your eyes open for are things like Brawler, Tough, or Nimble. They'll make for good melee fighters. Fast Walker or Jogger gives you increased movement speed. Industrious and Hard Worker will improve work speed. There's less favourable traits out there that you probably want to avoid, like Pyromaniac, which can trigger random mental breaks even if the colonist is perfectly happy. There's Slow Learner, that makes the colonist affected by it take an age to learn new skill levels. There's also a bunch of negative social traits like Abrasive, Annoying Voice, Creepy Breathing, Misandrist or Misogynist that will frequently lead to a social fight around your colony. So if possible, try not to pick starters that are going to get on each other's nerves. You might also want to be careful about colonists that have things that increase the stat mental break threshold, like the trait Too Smart. Whilst normally the traits that increase this threshold are fantastic, it makes the colonist more easily broken when experiencing a low mood, and very often, low mood is going to be unavoidable on the Rim, because bad stuff will happen all the time. It's manageable, just don't be surprised if your very neurotic, tortured artist colonist spends most of their time wandering around in a psychotic daze. As well as looking at these traits, you also want to pay attention to what they are incapable of. Whilst passions are nice to have in certain skills, any colonist can perform whatever work you need them to, as long as they aren't totally incapable of it. The biggest one to look out for here is incapable of violence. Life in Rimworld is not a walk in the park. If someone isn't willing to pick up a weapon and defend themselves, they're basically counting down the days until it goes very poorly for them. The other important part here is the health tab, and by extension, that colonist's age. Ideally, you don't want any injuries or maladies in here, but sometimes really good colonists come in with an addiction or a pretty bad scar. It's a way to balance them out being so good in another area. This one is up to you. Scars are going to lower the efficiency of the body part that they're on. So if a colonist has a particularly nasty leg scar, they're going to move more slowly, with any scars on their arms and hands lowering manipulation, which means reduced work speed and worse combat. Addictions will mean that you either need to produce the related drug to keep that colonist happy, or spend a long time trying to wean them off of it so that they can become healthy again. Older colonists may have fantastic stats, thanks to having lived for so long, but they're also far more likely to have an age-related illness. Cataracts, hearing loss, asthma, a bad back, or an artery blockage. So what would I normally look for here? I want 3 starting colonists that are under the age of 30 without any incapabilities, with ideally at least one minor passion, the small flame, in either melee or shooting. This means that they'll be able to develop some kind of proficiency in one type of combat relatively quickly. You can see in the team skills section at the bottom what the highest rank of each skill will be, minus animals, crafting, artistic and social. If you have a minor or a major in all of these boxes, you are pretty set for a comfortable start. If you're missing 1 or 2 of them, make sure you're keeping your eyes out in-game for any potential recruits with a passion that could better round out your colony. Now's the time for us to hit start and actually get into the game. It only took us a 10-minute wander to get here. We hear the distinctive guitar strum play, and the first thing to do is pause the game. Yep, hit spacebar, pause the game. We've got some basics that we need to get set up before we go any further. Alright, let's cover this UI section by section so that you actually know what buttons you're going to be playing with and why they matter. First off, the bottom right hand corner has 13 little icons that are either ticked or crossed, and I'm sure you can work out from context what the parts are above it. They're easy. Temperature, which relates to where your cursor is hovering, weather, in-game time, date, season, as well as the controls for the speed. You can use the hotkeys 1, 2 and 3 to cycle through the game speed, with spacebar always being your pause button. The magnifying glass opens up the search feature, so if you wanted to find steel, you could type it in here and it'll point you in all of the directions that you can find it. Bear in mind this search feature can only show things that you have uncovered on your map. It can't wall hack through mountains or show you sealed rooms. The icon list is something I see a lot of new players asking about. This is categorized mode. With it disabled, the resource list on the top left of the screen shows everything that you own in one long vomit of parts and numbers. Turning on categorize mode lets you close and open subfolders to keep your UI a lot cleaner. The thermometer shows your temperature overlay, helpful for working out if certain rooms in your base are too hot or too cold. The hammer is saying yes or no to automatically rebuilding parts of your base that get destroyed if they're in the home area, and the house next to it is whether you want your home area to automatically expand or not when you build something new. Don't worry, we'll cover the home area concept shortly. The jagged mountain button shows you terrain affordance. It's why I picked as a map with a river on it. With this turned on, you can see areas marked in blue or red, meaning building over those spaces is restricted in some way. The plant icon is for ground fertility. Vibrant green is best, dull green is good, yellow serviceable, and no colour means no planting. This is useful to turn on when you want to start growing crops. There's another house icon to the right of this, the one without the doors and windows. That's for your roof overlay. This shows areas that are covered by either man-made roofing or natural roofing, with 2 colour depths here as well. You have bright green and a deep dark green. The light green means that the roofing present can be removed if you would like. Dark green is overhead mounting, which means it's impenetrable from overhead dangers, but you can never get rid of it. The 4 squares toggle the Colonist bar on and off. If you ever really wanted to have a really clean UI, you can do it I guess, but it's normally best to know how your little jelly beans are doing throughout the game. The bars icon shows room stats, and when we get into building some rooms I'll return to this feature to show you how it can help. The sculpture will show beauty around the cursor when it's enabled. If we turn it on right now, we can see that plants and bushes are pretty, chunks of rock are ugly, and the mountainsides aren't the nicest to look at either. The 2 squares is going to toggle the visibility of zones. These are areas that you can place as a player. You have a couple of ways of hiding or showing them, with this being the easiest button to press if you want to hide all of them immediately. The final box is for the learning helper. If you didn't disable it in the options menu earlier, you can hide the empty frame of it here if you need to. So that's the quick buttons done. Let's go from right to left across the UI as it gets progressively more involved as we near that left side. The bottom rightmost button is simple. That's your menu options. If you want to save, load, change some options or quit, it's all there. As you would expect, the hotkey for this is the escape key. So if, for the sake of this example, you're chilling on Rimworld when you really shouldn't be, if you're supposed to be working, if you play on commitment mode, you can hit escape and then click quit to OS. It automatically saves your progress and drops you back into whatever you were supposed to be doing before your boss or overbearing parent looked over your shoulder. You're welcome. Then there's the faction screen. With just base game, this is quite nice and small, although if you purchase more of the DLC, it's going to grow to become quite involved. This gives you a quick heads up about how factions will react to you, as well as showing what factions can and can't be swayed with gifts. In this example, the Rough Outlander Union and Fierce Tribe are initially hostile, but they could be made neutral or even turn into allies. The Civil Outlanders and Gentle Tribe start as neutral, so they'll be the ones turning up with a trade caravan and offering you a quest, whereas the Savage Tribe and Pirate Gang are always hostile to you, meaning you're always going to have some human factions that will pose a threat to you. You can also see on this screen how certain factions react to one another. If you're in a situation where members from different factions are present on your map at the same time, they may not share the same hostile nature towards one another that you do, meaning in a fight they won't jump in to help either side. So make sure you're checking little things like this before you rely on a trade caravan to provide you help in a gunfight. They may simply watch it all go down and then wander off to post about it on their socials instead. The book icon is for the History tab. This has 3 sections on it. The wealth graph is helpful as it shows how much your colony has grown, and more importantly, how quickly you are potentially raising the threat that you're going to be facing. Without going into the custom settings when we were doing our choice of Storyteller, Rimworld bases the majority of weighting around the threats that you're going to face on the wealth of your colony. So, if you grow a lot of psychoid and turn it into a huge stockpile of expensive drugs in just a few days, you'll see a big old spike in your wealth, and you can expect that the next raid that shows up is going to include many more members than the previous one did. Ideally, what you want to see is slow, steady growth in here. It's not always possible, of course. Some things are always going to result in a pretty big spike. But if you find that your wealth in items is continually growing whilst your buildings and creatures are staying relatively stagnant, you may be stockpiling too many resources without actually spending them to improve your base or your colonists. Big stockpiles only ever attract big raids. Learning wealth management will be one of the core parts in getting better at Rimworld, whatever being good at a story generator game means anyway. If you're watching this part and feel like you already know the basics of the game but continually die around the 1 year mark because of a huge raid turning up that you don't have the manpower to deal with, chances are it's because your stockpiles are far bigger than your colony requires. The Messages tab here is handy to get a quick glance at any notifications that you may have dismissed or missed entirely. Like if you got a warning that a raid was turning up and you can't quite remember if it said they're going to attack immediately or if they're waiting around for a bit. The statistics page is a really clean breakdown of your colony if you ever needed to look at it. The world button here will take you to the overworld map. It's the same one that we used when we were picking a landing site. There are a few more options on here now, such as sending a caravan or exploring world quests when they pop up, but for now we're going to go back to our map and carry on covering the UI. I'll do a little bit of a section with the world later. Pressing quests is going to open up your quest log, which at this point will be empty. One thing you can quickly do at the start of every game, which is going to make for far more interesting offers, is open up reward preferences, and then uncheck accept goodwill on all of the factions. Normally when you get offered a quest, there are 3 potential rewards. One of them will be goodwill, and the other 2 are items, colonists or materials. With accept goodwill turned off, now you get 3 choices of items, colonists or materials. There are always going to be far easier ways of earning goodwill rather than doing quests for it. Research will open up your research tree. This is probably a little bit overwhelming to look at first thing, as you're handed a bunch of technology names that unlock further technologies, and then there's structures and crafting options, and you need to click individually through everything to read it all. For now, don't dig too deep into the tech tree. Just know that it's here, and this is where you're going to assign what research project you want to be worked on. The Wildlife tab will open up something huge, and that's because we live in a temperate forest. This will list all of the wild animals that are currently on your tile, as well as allowing you to quickly mark them for hunting. If they show a chance to retaliate when hunted, which is the percent under the claw near the bow icon, that means they may potentially fight back when injured. Alongside that, you can also see an option to tame wild animals and quickly mark them for taming with the hand icon. This also has that retaliation chance. The final icon, which looks like an animal head, shows if it is a predator. If this is present on the animal, it means that they will aggressively hunt other living things on your map, with the size of the animal determining what they are willing to attempt to hunt. Small creatures like foxes or cobras are only going to go for animals of equal size or smaller, whereas a wolf, cougar or bear may hunt your colonists if they are hungry enough. Make sure to keep an eye on this menu from time to time to ensure that predators aren't growing out of control on your map. Keeping them cold is going to be the safest option. From the Wildlife tab, we have the Animals tab. This is for your animals specifically. Any livestock or pets that you may own are in here. This tab can potentially have quite a lot going on, so it's going to be something we cover in a bit more depth once we have a few animals of our own to actually showcase it off. You will have been given an animal to start with because we picked the crash landed scenario, and depending on what that animal is, that's going to change if we need to build a pen or not. So when we do start building our base, I will be treating it as if you were given something like a donkey or a horse. Don't worry if you've got a dog or a cat that has no interest in living in a pen. It's still good to learn how to make one either way. After the Animals tab, we have one of the big ones to cover, the Assignment tab. This is where you're going to tell your colonists whether to automatically run or fight, what medicine to receive, what to wear, eat, take, read, as well as if you want them to keep medicine on their person at all times or not. This is one of the first things I set up at the start of every game, with a pretty straightforward selection process that you can follow too if you would like. It really isn't necessary if you do want to get straight into things though. I just find this an extremely helpful habit. First off, I leave people set to run if they're engaged in combat. If I want them to stay and fight, I will manually draft them and control them myself. The automatic combat AI in Rimworld is certainly something. For medicine allowance, it will depend on your starting scenario. We picked Crash Landed, which means we've been given industrial medicine for our starting resource, so let's change it to that instead of best quality. After selecting it on the top colonist, you can click, hold and drag it down the bar to apply that selection to everybody else too. We're doing this because it means if we acquire any Glitter World medicine, which is the best kind, it won't be used on minor injuries or small problems. It allows us to keep a little bit of a stockpile of really good stuff that we can hold back in case of any serious illnesses or deadly infections. Apparel policy is determining what our colonists can or can't wear. Chances are you don't want to go super deep into this stuff right off the bat, making exact outfits for people. So the very easy things to change are hit point tolerance of the gear, allowed quality, and turning off tainted apparel. Colonists are going to be unhappy if the gear that they're wearing has too much damage. Keeping the hit point tolerance from 51 to 100% means that they remove gear before it becomes tattered, allowing you to sell any gear that hits that threshold to a trader for a little bit of silver. I keep the quality set to a minimum expectation of normal, with legendary gear being the upper end. It stops colonists throwing on all kinds of random bits of crap that aren't actually providing much in the way of defense. I then untick allow tainted apparel. This is going to stop colonists from equipping clothing or armour that's previously been on a corpse, which helps in avoiding a mood debuff. While raiders may come in with really nice armour from time to time, if you strip them and put it on one of your own colonists, it's going to upset whoever's in it. For now, that'll do. If you find later on that colonists are equipping things automatically that you really don't want them to, like plate armour that's slowing them down, you can always open this policy page and turn individual parts on or off, as well as making specific policies for certain colonists if you want them to wear a more regimented outfit, like having a melee policy that includes marine armour and a shield belt, alongside a ranged policy that bans shield belts and keeps people wearing recon armour instead. The food policy is going to be following roughly the same rules, so we know what we're doing now. I do untick quite a lot more stuff in here though, just to make sure that our colonists aren't doing stupid things. I untick allow rotten for obvious reasons, and then I disable all raw food except for berries and insect jelly. All raw food besides those two comes with a mood debuff. Just be aware that eating any raw food always carries a risk of food poisoning, so if you'd like to avoid that entirely, leave all raw food disabled. You're also going to want to untick hay, kibble, raw resources, plants and corpses. This should keep colonists eating sensible meals and taking drugs if they need to. However, if you're in a situation where you really don't have any cooked food available and it's life or death levels of starvation, remember that you can re-allow foods in here in case of emergency. Whilst helping colonists keep their diet on the up and up is admirable, it's not worth dying over if you've got a freezer full of raw rice that they could have eaten. Drug policies can be a little bit daunting to set up as it has a different layout. For now, we're going to keep it nice and simple, but I'm going to set up a policy later on to schedule Psychite tea so you can see how it's done. We're going to leave beer, ambrosia and Psychite tea ticked as for recreation. I disable smoke leaf in that category because it's painfully debilitating to a colonist's productivity, and at this stage of the game we really don't need that. I also uncheck all allowances for addictions. Hopefully you didn't pick a colonist with an addiction at the start of the game, that means this isn't going to be an issue. If you did, it's up to you if you want to keep this allowance enabled, which will let them take a dose as required to avoid a mood debuff, or forbid it, which is going to make them go cold turkey for a while to try and overcome it. Then there's the reading policy. For the most part, this is fine to leave as it is, meaning colonists are free to read whatever books, schematics or textbooks you get your hands on in order to gain recreation. The last part is around carrying medicine. You can change what type of medicine a colonist carries here too. Ideally, you want them to be carrying the same type of medicine that you're expecting them to use when they treat another colonist. There's a couple of different approaches that you could take here. Either you could have everybody carrying medicine all of the time, and then they can drop it as needed so that your doctors have enough if they're performing an emergency tend in the field, or you can have only your doctors carrying medicine. That way they won't run out anytime soon because there's actually some kept in the stockpile, rather than being held in everyone else's pockets. From here we have the schedule page. There's only 2 real things of note in here. Firstly, you can get rid of that Area 1 if needed to keep your UI nice and clean by pressing Manage Areas and deleting it. Secondly, you don't need to go nuts over setting up an exact schedule. There's only 2 traits you really need to look out for on Colonists that will alter how they need to be set up, and for pretty much everybody else, 8 hours of sleep between 10 and 6 will see them about right, with 2 hours of recreation in the evening before bedtime. The traits you're going to need to adjust for are Quick Sleeper, as a colonist with that is usually able to operate on 5 hours of sleep instead, potentially less if you split them up with a little bit of a nap in the afternoon too. The other trait is Night Owl, which means you need to flip the 8 hours of sleep to land between 10 AM and 6 PM instead. That way they won't be complaining about being awake during the day, and you can also keep your colony operating overnight too. Now, every time I've tried to force a really specific work, recreation and sleep cycle in the schedule page, it's never ended well. For the sake of not driving yourself crazy, just leave the colonists on do anything. Provided they're getting enough sleep and have a little bit of dedicated time for recreation, they're normally pretty productive throughout a day. Now we're going to hit one of the bigger speed bumps for new players, the Work tab, and assigning manual priorities. Now let's make it clear. You do not need to use manual priorities if you don't want to. You can run a colony with just yes/no options on certain work types, but that means that certain work types are going to be significantly more difficult to accomplish without setting a lot of your colonists to ignore a lot of jobs. It's why learning how to set a baseline for manual priorities is a better idea. You don't need to get all kinds of crazy with it, just set up something that will stop a colonist wasting time on a job that they are not great at, whilst also having it so that they're not standing around idle once all of their jobs are done. So with manual priorities you are given the numbers 1 to 4 to add into these boxes. The colonist will check for what work to do by sweeping from left to right across those job types, looking for the highest number. So, let's say that you've got growing set to 2 and construction set to 3. Provided there's no jobs that need doing that you've put at priority 1, nor any other jobs to the left of growing that are priority 2, they will go on plant and harvest your crops. Once they're done planting and harvesting, they continue with that sweep. If there's no more jobs at priority 2, and the next thing they hit is construction at priority 3, they'll go and help with building and deconstruction. You have to learn to think in staggers, basically. Having an entire row of jobs set to 2 is exactly the same as using the yes/no work tab system, so you typically want to prioritise jobs that they are skilled and passionate about, with things like Doctor and Warden always being a top priority. You can see how I've established my work layout for the colonists here. Again, you can have it as involved or as straightforward as you would like. Not everyone needs to do every job that they are capable of. If you're happy for people to work on what they're passionate about and only do jobs of that type, that's totally valid. They'll be very happy with their work and will gain the most benefits and experience by doing that type. Equally, if you're building a big perimeter wall around your colony and find that you've got 4 people standing idle whilst one lone builder is trying to do the entire thing by themselves, you can quickly add construction as a low priority job to your layabouts, and they'll pitch in and help get that wall finished. A useful hotkey to know in this tab is holding down Shift when you click on a work type at the top. Left click increases the job priority for everyone, and right click lowers it. If your base is filthy because you've got cleaning as the lowest priority on everybody, like I normally do, it's helpful from time to time to make it the top priority for a day or so, just to clean up around the base and have it not be quite so awful for a while. Now bear in mind, your own starting colonists are going to have different passions to mine. Our work tabs are not going to match up 1-to-1. However, you can see the structure that I've gone for when I've layered my priorities, so hopefully you can create something similar for your own starting group. Finally, you have the Architect menu. This is how we interact with the world. We can give out orders, construct bases, place buildings, all kinds of stuff. This is another one of those things that can be a little bit overwhelming, but by building our starter base together and using these tools as and when we need to, you're going to very quickly get a handle on them. Right, let's actually start playing the game. If at some point during this tutorial you have a negative event occur, like a wild animal goes mad and decides to attack you, or a raid shows up on your doorstep, you can quickly skip to the chapter called Combat, or head to this timestamp. If it's an illness or if one of your colonists gets hurt in that encounter, you can also go to the chapter called Medical, or hop to this timestamp. Unfortunately, it's so hard for me to predict exactly when these are going to happen in your game and what might be thrown at you, especially as the speed of your colony development is largely going to be down to the skill set of your initial colonists, and I don't know what you picked. The first, and arguably the most important thing to do, is get every basic need covered in some manner. In Rimworld, your core needs are food, sleep, and recreation, with minor needs for beauty, comfort, and outdoors, or indoors, depending on traits. You're also going to need to make sure you're taking care of your colonist's temperature by making rooms that keep them safe from the scorching sun or the biting cold, or by crafting clothing that provides adequate insulation, as being too warm is going to cause heat stroke, and being too cold will result in hypothermia, both of which can be fatal if you allow them to accumulate to dangerous levels. The final part to manage with your colonists is going to be their mood. Positive offsets will keep them nice and happy. A colonist that manages to stay in a consistently high mood has a chance to receive an inspiration. These are always a positive thing, like increasing their work speed or increasing the amount of money that they will earn in the next trade deal. Negatives, of course, are going to push their mood bar down towards danger zones of minor, major, and extreme mental breaks. They're indicated by the little white notches on the mood bar. In today's lingo, these are probably going to be known as crash outs. Prior to that, it would have been a freak out, and sometime long before that, it would have been called going postal. Whatever you want to call it, mental breaks are bad. You lose control of the colonist that has a mental break, and they will not be able to contribute to the colony until they've worked through their problems and blown off a little bit of steam, sometimes in a more aggressive manner than others. Of these 3 core need bars to the left, the only one that absolutely needs player intervention to be fulfilled is the need for food. Colonists are always able to sleep on the floor if they're exhausted, and they can go for a walk and stare at the sky if they're extremely bored. That means that the most important thing, and the top of our survival priority right now, is finding a reliable source of food and creating some kind of storage to keep it viable for future consumption. Before we throw down any kind of building blueprints, let's look at our map and see what we've actually got to work with in terms of open space, fertile soil, and natural cover. We have an area to the left with a lovely natural mountain formation. It covers the north and east approaches, but it puts us extremely close to the western edge of the map, so it's best to avoid building here. If enemies turn up from this side of the map, they're going to be on top of us basically instantly. If this kind of shape was in the centre of the map, it'd be fantastic. What we actually have to the centre north of the river is a pretty open space. It has a large amount of fertile soil that's easily accessible around that river edge, and we've even got a steam vent nice and close to it too. The rightmost edge of the map to the north is limited on space and very exposed to the northern map edge. Everything south of the river has a great deal of open space. However, the fertile soil is a bit more sporadic, and we'd need to do quite a lot of mining to expand our building footprint here. So I'm going to settle in the centre north. We're going to want to build a storeroom to get this process started. This is what we'll use to keep all of our initial resources out of the elements, which will stop them from deteriorating, as well as making it easier for our colonists to keep all the building materials in one place, which will avoid them walking back and forth across the map repeatedly. To get started then, we need walls, a door, a stockpile zone, and we're also going to need to allow the parts that landed alongside our colonists when we started the game. The easiest way to do this is to open up your architect menu, select the orders tab, right click on the allow order and select unforbid all items. You could drag this allow order across the entire map if you really wanted to, but the right click option is much faster. Walls are located in the Structures tab of the Architect menu and can be built from wood, metal or stony material. For now, we're going to use wood because it's cheap and very quick to throw down. We will want to replace it down the line, because wood is also extremely flammable. We'll cover some materials a bit later as there's more involved than just does it burn yes or no, but for now I'm placing down a 13 by 13 wooden box. I use the Q&E hotkeys to cycle between building type so I can select box drag. That way I only need to go corner to corner rather than placing 4 individual lines. Of course, this room needs a door, which we can select from the Structures tab as well and place it right over one of the wall blueprints to replace it with a door blueprint. I like to keep my doors central for this starting stockpile, and I find it best to make more than one entrance and exit, but you can build however you wish. The only thing I'd advise against for now is placing the door right at the corner. We'll go about this weird little detail when it comes to combat basics. Let's just try and keep it as simple as possible for now. The last thing to do here is actually make your stockpile. So we go into the Zones tab in the Architect menu, select Stockpile Zone and drag it to fill out the interior of this wooden box. It's 11 by 11 tiles. We can see this drops a highlight colour on the ground so we can tell that there's a stockpile there, and selecting it shows that it's called Stockpile Zone 1. It's 121 tiles in size. If we hit the storage button here, we can see what is and isn't allowed to be stored in this area. For now, we can leave it as is, because all of our starting resources need to be moved here, with the default settings for a stockpile zone including everything besides chunks, plants and corpses, which we aren't bothered about in this starting area. If you want, you can use the icon below the storage button to rename this zone. For example, I'm going to call it Starter Stock, but this is purely an optional step and you can skip it if needed. Whilst our colonists now get to work building this storeroom and dragging our scattered materials over to the stockpile, let's go over why I chose 13 by 13 for the room size. All of our walls are capable of holding up a roof, which our storeroom is going to need to ensure that all exposure to the outdoors is fully blocked, with each individual wall having a 7-tile circle of reach from itself, regardless of the material that you've used to build it. You can see the support radius if you go to place a column. These are capable of supporting a roof, just like a wall, but columns won't keep out the elements or stop a colonist from moving through it. What this means is that the largest square room that you can build, without needing to make extra support, is 13 by 13 tiles. Of course, you could make it into a rectangle, have it 3 times as long, just as long as it doesn't go any further in the other direction. That would still provide enough support to hold up the roof. So if you do want to build bigger rooms in your colony, you either need to place some supporting columns in the centre of them, or you have to add a few extra walls dotted around the middle to provide that additional support. Depending on the skill level of your builders, you might also be noticing that you're having some pop-ups appear whilst these walls are being built that say construction botched, and result in the blueprint reappearing. These botches can occur simply because your colonist has a low skill in the associated work type, but it might also be happening if that colonist has a health condition that's reducing their stats. Given that we picked a crash landed start, it's most likely that your builder might still be suffering from crypto sleep sickness, which is going to be lowering the success chance. Fortunately, this only lasts for a few in-game hours after starting, so it shouldn't be too long before they get over it and wrap up construction on your storeroom. You can see if any colonists have this condition by selecting them and clicking on the health tab. This is also where any injuries will be displayed, things like scars, addictions, illnesses, or implants and prosthetics. If you picked up a starting colonist that had an addiction to psychite, for example, you'd find it listed in here, along with the severity and recovery time. Alright, hopefully that was roughly enough time to get this room constructed and have most of the materials be shifted over. You might have noticed that the roof was automatically built when construction on the outline of the room had finished. Whilst you can place and remove roofing manually with the associated zone tools, for the most part, if you place something that looks like it should be a room, the game's going to treat it as one once it's finished. Now, we don't need to panic over fixing our food needs right away because we started with lots of items called packaged survival meals. So we've got a few options on how to proceed from here. We're probably going to want some beds down before it gets too late, and we might also want an additional source of recreation to avoid our colonists getting bored because they've only got 1 or 2 ways of relaxing. Now, we could build a separate barracks or even individual bedrooms for our colonists, but it's going to be quite work intensive and chances are it won't be finished in time. That could end up forcing our colonists to spend the first night on the floor. So for now, I'm going to open up the architect menu, select the furniture tab, and then place down 3 single beds in this storeroom. I want to make sure that they're made out of wood too. I don't want to waste steel building these beds. The option to change the material choice pops up when you click on a piece of furniture, provided that you don't move your cursor away too quickly. And you can tell what furniture has a material choice by the little tab in the top right corner. If something doesn't have that, it means it can only be constructed with the listed materials, like a torch or a standing lamp. That'll be our sleeping taken care of, but this storeroom is dark, which is not great as our colonists are going to move and work far more slowly in a dark environment. We don't have any power yet either, so for now let's place down a quick torch lamp right in the middle of the room. This is going to illuminate the immediate area and also provide a little bit of warmth. If we have the time, let's also try and squeeze in a 2x1 table with 3 stools around it. You'll also find them in that furniture menu. Then we hop over to the tab marked Recreation and put down a horseshoes pin outside of our storeroom, ensuring that the areas marked in white to at least one side of it are unobstructed. This is its interaction spot. Again, we're making sure that these are all built using wood. The table is going to provide a place to gain social or solitary relaxation, as well as removing the infamous 8 without table mood debuff that people make all the memes about. The horseshoes pin is a dedicated source of recreation, so having these few pieces of furniture is going to provide enough diversity for our colonists that they'll no longer get bored of one type of recreation, meaning they are always able to fulfill that need. So with just these few buildings, we are now fully covered for rest and recreation. And whilst we do currently have food, we aren't making any. So that's still at the top of our to-do list. For now, living out of this little crap shack for a few days isn't the worst thing in the world. So tomorrow we'll establish a production chain for meals and fix up the accommodation for our animals. If it's needed, of course. You might not have got an animal that needs a pen. Just like how we built the outline for our storeroom, we're going to draw some fences. These are located in the Structures tab, and we're going to use one of our existing walls to draw the pen outline off of. This fence is also going to need a gate to allow entry in and out of it. Although colonists can step over a fence if needed, they will move more slowly whilst doing so. Finally, to designate the enclosed space that we have built, as a pen, we need to put down a marker. These markers aren't under your Structures tab, they're in the Miscellaneous tab. Now, chances are if you've been building everything out of wood up until this point, your supplies might be running a little bit low. So, whilst our builder is busy constructing this pen, let's get some trees chopped down. We can do this simply by opening the Orders tab on the Architect menu and find the option for Chop Wood. Then, drag it over some nearby trees. A little thing of note here. Chopping wood is considered plant cutting work type. So if a little bit later on you find that your planters are spending all of their time harvesting and replanting crops rather than chopping down trees for you, you might need to set the priority for plant cut above growing. This will make sure that you don't run out of wood and end up twiddling your thumbs waiting for a lot of other work to be finished before construction can resume. Let's take a bit of time to watch this pen finish up first so that we can quickly go over how they work. Firstly, you need to make sure that you've got a colonist with the work type animals enabled, and it probably needs to be quite high priority. Once the pen is classed as secure and the marker has been constructed, you'll see that your animal handler is going to grab the roaming animal and bring them into the pen. If you then select that pen marker, the little signpost thing, it'll highlight the interior of the pen and display the important details, like the natural nutritional growth and consumption by the animal that's contained within it. Pressing the animals button will let you allow or deny certain types of animals being kept in specific pens. So if you wanted to keep various species in your colony, but don't want them all cohabiting in the same pen, this is how you'd go about saying yes or no to what should be in each specific one, with you then being able to separate by sex to avoid a population explosion when the bull gets a little bit overzealous in a field full of cows. The food display will also let you know roughly how many of a certain animal this pen could support. The larger animals are going to require more nutrition, as you'd expect. This is only going to be taking into account the natural nutritional growth during the correct seasons though. So if you do want to keep animals in a biome that has very cold winters, like we'll have in a temperate forest, you do need to consider how you're going to feed them when the plant life goes dormant. Finally, you have a button marked Auto Cut. This can be used to automate removal of plants that aren't nutritionally relevant in the pen. Or you can use it to remove everything except for grass and dandelions if you wanted to be really specific about it. You can leave this as totally automated by ticking the Auto Cut Plants in Pen box, which will perform the plant cut action every 24 hours, or you can manually trigger it by hitting the Cut Now button instead whenever you need to. Bear in mind that this will not be telling your planters to sow any seeds in the pen area, it's only going to prune naturally occurring growth. With our animal fed and sorted, it's time to move on to our colonists. Temperate forests have berry bushes as standard, so in a pinch if we needed to, we could harvest the berries on this map and live off of those for a while. The easiest way to do this is to find a single berry bush, either using the search tool or by scanning your tile manually. Then select it and zoom out as far as possible. From here, double click that selected berry bush and that's going to automatically select all visible berry bushes on your screen. Now simply hit harvest and you'll have marked a good amount of free food for collection. If needed, you can repeat this process around other parts of the map if you wanted to snag all of the berries possible, but it's not necessary for our current situation. We really aren't struggling for food, so rather than relying on these limited berry bushes that grow on our map, it's time to get some crops of our own down. For this, we're going to use the Grow Zone option in the Zones tab of the Architect menu. Before we go placing our grow zones, it's nice to turn on that fertility overlay so we can see where has the most beneficial soil, which shows us that there's a nice area to the south of our stockpile full of fertile ground, right next to the river. I'm going to go over a few concepts in this section too, with a lot of it feeding back across basically the entire game, so you might want to hit pause here on your game if you don't want it to get too far ahead whilst I go over these parts. Firstly, what's soil fertility and why does it matter? If I pop down a little grow zone in the area, we can see that it defaults to growing potatoes. Now what we're going to do here is go to select the plant that we would like to be planted, then hit those big eye icons to the right of the plants. This is the information panel. Basically everything in the game has one of these, and they'll always tell you what you need to know about the item in question. Not only that, you can jump between certain item panels by following links within them, like how if you select the harvest yield on the potato plants, it lets you click on potatoes and then you can see the information panel for that item instead. I get it though, these can be pretty overwhelming, it's throwing a whole bunch of numbers in your face. The thing is, you don't need to learn everything about this all at once. You just need to find the answer to the question that you have at the time and then move on, rather than feeling obliged to read every little thing on display. Right now, we're talking about soil fertility, and I can see two parts of this item information that contain the word fertility. Fertility requirements and fertility sensitivity. If we click on one of these, it'll show the concept in greater detail to the right. What we can see here is that potatoes don't need very much soil fertility, but they also don't really benefit from it anyway, as they have a low fertility sensitivity. So close that info page and instead let's look at the one for rice. Rice needs the same amount of fertility, 70%, but it's 100% sensitive rather than 40%, which means it's going to get a much greater benefit from being planted in this nice fertile soil. There are a few other differences we could compare if we wanted to go back and forth, like rice has a much faster growing time but a lower harvest yield, as well as a shorter lifespan. That lifespan isn't too worrying, that measures how long a plant can survive before it will naturally wither. You'll normally have harvested it long before that number matters. Equally, the smaller yield makes sense because the rice is growing very fast. However, the growing time says 3 days, but you'll find that it takes longer than that in-game. That's because that growing time does not include the sun rising and setting, nor is it counting the impact of the fertility that we're planting it in. This means you should use this grow time as a more general guideline as to how plants will compare to one another, not an exact rule. The plants that benefit most from high fertility are corn, cotton, devilstrand, heelroot, rice, smokeleaf, strawberries and tinctoria, as a super straightforward guide to follow. Let's make sure we're using our best soil for these plants. You're not doing the wrong thing if you grow other things in fertile soil, you'll just be getting a lower return is all. With all of that in mind, we're going to swap over from planting potatoes and put some rice in this fertile soil along the shoreline. Now comes the tricky part. How do we know how much we need to plant for this to be sustainable? Fortunately, the math wizards in the world have already got this down to a science, but right now getting into all of those numbers for all of the different plants is a crazy level of information overload, so let's keep it nice and simple. We're going to say that 15 tiles of rice in rich soil is our baseline for making simple meals for each individual colonist we have. Now, we're going to want to plant just a little bit extra to make sure we're always keeping some back in reserve in case of emergency, but we don't want to go overboard and plant miles and miles and miles of rice paddies. We don't have the manpower to look after it, nor do we have the storage facilities to keep it fresh. Currently, anyway. Knowing that 15 tiles will break even for us, let's play it safe and plant 20 tiles of rice per colonist. That means we need 60 rice plants in total along this shoreline. Again, if you wanted to, you could rename this zone to Rice Field, so that you know when you click on it later what your intention for it was. It's really helpful if you take long breaks between playing to refresh your memory when you come back to the colony. Whilst we're doing our planting jobs then, let's get some other crops in the ground here too. I'm going to move over to the fertile soil that's further to the east so I can expand that rice field later when we get some new colonists in. It saves on needing to replant something or having to split my grow zones up. We're going to want some heelroot and cotton on basically every colony, but I'm also going to put down a dedicated grow zone for psychoid so that later we can talk about drugs, tolerances and policies. If you want to keep your own colony on the straight and narrow, you can skip that step, but you might find that a little bit of psychoid tea goes a long way in the early game. Heelroot has a fairly long growing period, and you'll be pretty surprised with how fast you can get through a stockpile of it. So in the early game I typically overplant it and cut back later if I find that my stockpile is somewhat overburdened with it. Let's start with a field that's 50 tiles in size for heelroot. Some of you may notice that when selecting heelroot, the game is going to warn you that you currently lack a planter for this job, as heelroot has a skill requirement of 8 to be planted. Fortunately, if you have a colonist with even a minor passion in planting, they'll pretty quickly level up to this by taking care of other crops and chopping wood for your construction jobs. So we can leave this grow zone in waiting, as it were. They're going to get around to it eventually when they're ready. You'll want a little bit of cotton for certain buildings and potentially the odd bit of emergency clothing. So again, we're going to put down 50 tiles of this to keep our planter occupied. Finally, I'm going to place 30 tiles of psychoid, which is 10 per colonist. This is another plant with a fairly lengthy growing period, so we want to make sure that we grow enough of it to last us between harvests, without growing so much of it that we flood our stockpile with expensive materials after a single harvest. Finally, if you're feeling a little bit extra, you can plant a small patch of tinctoria. This is used to dye surfaces and is exceptionally fast growing. I'd only recommend placing a small amount of this to avoid your planter being constantly occupied with harvesting and replanting it, especially as the dye that is harvested from this is shelf stable, meaning it's very safe to accumulate this slowly over time with no risk of it spoiling on your shelves. That's planting done then. Now, some of our colonists are going to have their work cut out for quite some time. So I'm hoping you've got a nice little stockpile of wood ready to keep your construction efforts fueled. If you don't yet have a good stockpile of wood, don't forget that you can increase the priority on plank cutting so that chopping wood is done before work on the grow zones. If we're going to have raw food coming in, we're also going to need a way to cook it. As earlier when I went over setting up our assignments for food policies, I made a point about forbidding colonists from eating raw ingredients. Not only that, if we're going to be making fresh meals with homegrown ingredients, they aren't going to last forever like our legally different, not at all calorie mate packaged survival meals. And then to top it all off, if we want to do any of this, we need to get some power established too. So let's break this down step by step and get our base up to the industrial age. Thanks to the crash landed start, we've already got all the tech we need to make this possible too. First step, get some power down. Now we have access to 3 sources of power generation in our power tab, as well as the conduits that transport power around our base. Whilst wind turbines are nice, with green energy being completely free, we currently don't have batteries. That means when the wind stops blowing, our base enters a blackout. Not ideal. That leaves us with a chem fuel powered generator or a wood fired generator. Given that we don't have chem fuel at the minute, the choice is pretty much made for us. Wood fired it is. This is going to generate 1000 watts of power, a super easy number to work with. If by some chance you pick starting colonists that had very little skill in construction, you might get stuck here, as the wood-fired generator requires a construction skill of at least 4 to put together. If you ended up in this scenario, it's not the end of the world. You don't need to start repeatedly building things and deconstructing them to try and level up that skill either. Your starting map is littered with ruins. They are fantastic sources of experience thanks to using deconstruction. Just make sure that you don't unlock the thing known as the Ancient Danger. You're going to be given a warning letter when someone gets too close to this structure. It's typically the only thing you'll find that's completely sealed on your map, with its walls in perfect condition. So stick to deconstructing damaged walls, steles, columns and tables that you can find. The urns are quite nice to grab and use in your own base if you want to put some decor down. Just be aware that if you do claim these or uninstall them for your own base, you might need to recheck the home zone area. It'll automatically expand around them. That's not ideal. It means your colonists will try and keep the floor on that random space clean, as well as trying to keep fires from spreading there too. Whilst the game automatically expanding your home zone is helpful, you need to be aware of interactions like this, so check your home area every now and again and make sure you trim it where necessary. Hopefully you've got someone with enough skill to build a wood-fired generator. If you've not, you now know how to earn it. And fingers crossed you've also got enough wood in storage to keep this thing fueled as well, as it's going to consume 75 wood every 3.5 days. You want this generator to be outside of your storeroom because it kicks out a significant amount of heat if it's built indoors as well. Whilst that won't be a bad thing if you live in a cold biome or during a winter season, your colonists are going to be sweating their knackers off in the middle of summer with a generator running inside. Now, this generator can connect directly to other parts that require power, but we want to make sure that the power we're generating is being transported across our entire base. That's what conduits are for. Personally, I only ever use hidden conduits. They look much cleaner and they completely avoid a negative event known as bzzzt, which completely discharges all of your stored power and causes an explosion somewhere in your conduit lines. If you'd rather save on a little bit of steel and get your power lines down quickly, you can use normal conduits instead, but just be aware that our current base is made of lovely flammable wood, and as soon as we add a battery into this scenario, we're one bad event away from an inferno that will likely destroy everything. Provided you only ever use hidden conduits, you will never experience that negative event. I build my conduits by placing them over, or I guess in this case, technically under existing walls, but use whatever style suits your personal preference. I've seen people that build lines right through the centre of their rooms, which will save on resources compared to how I build, and there are others that place them in an extremely specific grid beneath the entire base, similar to how you would build an all-encompassing grid in city skylines. Ultimately, no wrong choice here, as long as the conduits that you're building can reach all of the devices that require power. It's why I place mine beneath the walls. I never build rooms so big that they can't reach every interior tile, and it keeps it nice and simple to just drag it immediately over a new room whenever I add something to my base. That is our power generation down and our conduit lines established. Let's do something really simple and swap over from our torch lamp to an electric lamp to show how easily things connect to this grid. Whilst trying to place the lamp, you can see that it draws a little yellow wire from the lamp to the nearest conduit. This shows what it's trying to connect to. Provided that the conduit that it's aiming for has power flowing through it, it'll immediately start working. Another small note about hidden conduits compared to standard ones is that hidden conduits do not display the little black wire when connecting a device. I find this also helps make my base look a lot cleaner. No need to have cables lying all over the floor that people will trip on. You're going to need to select and deconstruct your torch lamp first. The hotkey for this is X, and it's quite a helpful one to remember. Then we can put down an electric lamp instead that's going to provide slightly more light but no heat. You can see the difference in the light provided in the lower left of the screen when you mouse over an empty tile in your storeroom. The very corners of our storeroom with a torch were 31% lit. When we replace it with a standing lamp, that goes up to 50%. 50% light is the highest amount that a standard artificial source can put out. This amount of light results in no debuff to work speed or accuracy when fighting, but it's not considered bright enough to grow crops, which is why you'll notice that during the day, the outdoors is classed as 100% lit. If you do want to grow crops indoors, there's a way to do that with Sunlamps, but we'll cover that later as it needs a lot more power, and we have more important things to do right now. Continuing on through the chain of requirements then. Now that we have our power established, we need a room that we're going to use to store our food inside. That will also be able to keep cold. This is a great opportunity to learn a whole bunch of things. We're going to start by building a 9x7 box off the side of our storehouse and make sure that some conduits are running through it as well. You can build this room separately if you'd prefer, but for the example I'm trying to showcase right now, it makes more sense to keep them connected. If you are building it separately, make sure that you link the conduit from our existing stockpile room over to the freezer room. And make sure you place a door on this room, leading to the outside. Now, if you've been building and finding that the rock chunks on the map are kind of getting in the way, we can quickly take care of that by throwing down a dumping stockpile zone for them. Regardless of which stockpile zone you choose, they both have the same potential settings. They just come with a different default, so this is going to speed up the setup. I'm going to place a dumping stockpile zone to the left of our base, open up the storage settings for it, and uncheck corpses. Now the only things that can be stored in this zone are chunks, the big rocks that we can see laying around the map. They won't be dragged here automatically like other supplies though, so if you do want any of these chunks moving out of the way, you need to drag the Haul Things order over the top of them. That's going to mark them for moving. Again, if you wanted to, you can always rename this zone. Now we're going to set up another stockpile zone in our freezer. This is going to make use of the priority system, which is something we haven't touched so far. Drag the stockpile over the interior of the new room that we've placed and open up the storage settings for it. I'm going to call this one Freezer. We want to change normal priority here to preferred. If you have two stockpiles that exist with the same items allowed, they'll be hauled to the stockpile which has the highest priority, or in the case of both zones having equal priority, the closest. Now, what we don't want is items that don't naturally decay to be stored in here. It's going to be a waste of space to stockpile wood in our freezer because that can happily sit at an ambient temperature without spoiling. So we're going to uncheck everything by hitting clear all and then set up my standard freezer stockpile instead. Untick allow rotten because we don't want to keep rotten things in a freezer. It's not exactly helpful. Then we tick the entire category for food because that's nice and simple. At this stage in the game, I also want to keep my drugs in the freezer. That's purely because it makes them easy to locate. Some people also like to keep their herbal medicine in the freezer too, as it can spoil. However, that takes over 2 years to happen, so I prefer to keep my medicine close to colonist beds to avoid travel back and forth in case of an emergency. Wort is an item that can also spoil. It's part of the beer making process, so we're going to tick that as well. In raw resources, we have plant matter. Most of this stuff can spoil, so again, for the sake of keeping our stockpiles straightforward, all plant matter now goes into our freezer. Finally, we want corpses to be stored in the freezer too, but we want to be pretty specific about it. We've already said no to rotten corpses, so only fresh targets that are available to be butchered can be stored, which is good, but we only want animal corpses in our freezer. We don't want to fill it with dead raiders or mechanoids, because we're not eating toasters or people. Yet, anyway. From here on, we can upgrade the storage from a wardrobe kind of approach to something that isn't totally grim to look at. Let's add some shelves. It's entirely up to you how you want to put these down and if you want to use singles or doubles. Shelves are useful because they store 3 stacks of a single item compared to the basic stockpile zone that only stores 1 thing in each space. Now, we don't want to individually set up all of these new shelves, that's going to take forever. Let's make life super easy for ourselves. Double click on one of the shelf blueprints before they've started to be built, or wait for them all to be finished if you got ahead of me here, then double click on the finished shelving. Provided that these are the only shelves you've built up until this point, you'll see that it selects everything in the visible area, namely all of the freezer storage we just made. We can join them all together by hitting the link settings button. Now when we change the storage on one of the shelves, all of the others have the same changes applied too. Lovely. What's even easier is that we can select the stockpile zone that's still on the floor and hit copy settings. That's going to take all of the storage rules that we made for our freezer. Then we click on one of the shelves that we just joined together and hit the paste button. Boom. All of the stuff that we want to be kept frozen is now sorted on here too. The final thing that we need to do for this storage is that we're still prioritizing the floor and the shelves at the same level, whereas we're going to prefer that people will make use of these shelves given that we just spent time and resources to build them. So, take the shelving priority and put it to important rather than preferred. Now our colonists aim to put food on the shelves first. If the shelves are full, they at least put it inside the freezer, and if the freezer's totally packed, at the very least they bring it to the storeroom. Now that our storage is organised, it's time to make this room cold. Otherwise it's less of a walk-in freezer and more of a cupboard. Open the architect menu and go to the temperature tab. Here we can find the cooler. This is another building that has a minimum level of construction required. This time it's 5. So remember the deconstruction experience farm if you need to get another level on your builder. The cooler has a cold side, shown as blue, and a hot side, shown as red. Something that regularly trips up new players is thinking that coolers also act as heaters. Whilst you can wiggle it around to work that way, it's awkward and overly involved. If you want to make a room warmer, you'll have a much better time by placing an actual heater, not reversing a cooler. We're going to spin this cooler around until the blue side is pointing inwards on our freezer. The red side should be facing the outdoors. Then we need to wait for it to be built before we can set it up to work as we need it to. Our freezer's also pretty dark, so whilst we wait for all this to happen, why not get a little bit of light inside? We can use a wall light here rather than a standing lamp, as it's a small enough room that the less powerful wall light is still providing enough illumination across all of it, and it'll save us a bit of space on the floor too. Once everything has been built, let's select that cooler. If we look in the bottom left information panel, we can see that the target temperature is currently set to 21 degrees, and the cooler itself is reading the temperature of the room that the cold side is facing. That means if it notices that the room that it's set to cool down is warmer than its target temperature, it's going to kick in and try to bring that temperature down. The hot side of the cooler is an exhaust. This is where it pushes out the warm air that it's replacing. This means that yes, you could keep your freezer cool and a room behind it warm by dumping the exhaust directly into it. However, that warm room is going to be unstable in its temperature as the cooler is spiking on and off as required to try and keep your freezer cold. Once it's achieved its target temperature, it drops to low power mode and stops running until it's needed again. Anyway, we need to lower the temperature of this cooler so that it's actually making the room a freezer. I aim for super chilly, minus 20 degrees. You can do that by using the plus and minus temperature buttons on the gizmo bar when you've got the cooler selected. So why do I aim for minus 20 when hitting 0 is enough to keep food frozen and avoid spoiling? You'll notice that as food dips below 10 degrees, it starts to get additional time on its spoiling rates as it's counted as refrigerated now. Eventually it loses that timer entirely when it hits a frozen status in a 0 degree environment. The issue is, that temperature is going to fluctuate back and forth between frozen and chilled constantly if you only aim to hit 0 degrees. With that in mind, why would I not go for -5? Why go so much further? Well, the internal room temperature will have a lot of variables. The outside temperature is the main one, but you've also got to consider the thickness and the health of the walls that you've used in building the room, the type of roof that is above the room, the temperature of any adjacent rooms, and the frequency that the door to the freezer is being opened and closed. It's why we only made one door leading in and out of the freezer. Doors lose a considerable amount of temperature, so the more of them that you build, the harder that cooler is going to have to work. If you'd ended up building a really big freezer rather than this simple one, chances are you're going to need more than one cooler to keep its temperature down as well. So the reason that we're aiming to hit -20 is to help as much as possible in keeping the interior temperature reliably frozen at all times. If we happen to have a power cut or if the cooler breaks down, it's got a larger temperature range to play with before the food comes back up to a dangerous temperature that will allow for spoiling. Let's quickly make this freezer more secure, as well as showing some alternative builds that you could utilise in another colony. Coolers are naturally going to be a weak point in your base design, as they are likely the part that has the lowest health that's always accessible to raiders. Your wooden walls and even wooden doors have more health than the cooler, and raiders typically aim for the place that is the fastest to break through. So this gives us a good opportunity to open the roofing zone tool. What we're going to do here is build a chimney, so that the cooler can still dump the hot air out, whilst it's also protected from external attacks. We're going to use the build roof area zone tool to drag out a 2x3 area behind the cooler, like so. Then we'll take the remove roof area zone tool and tap the same tile as the exhaust from our cooler, so it should look like this. You could use the ignore roof area zone, but the removal tool is forcefully telling your builders to keep that area clear. It's going to work more reliably. We need to use a little bit of a trick here too, otherwise there's a non-0% chance that things arriving on your tile via drop pod could land right down your chimney and be stuck in a 1x1 hotbox. Let's grab a simple wooden barricade from the security tab and place it right where the exhaust lands. This thing isn't going to block the temperature from escaping, but it will stop things landing on that tile. Perfect. Once that's been built, let's go ahead and place down the walls underneath where we designated that build roof area. And whilst the last bit is being built, here's a few alternatives for your freezer builds, including an internal chimney design, especially useful if you're using multiple coolers, as this structure can also support a larger building footprint as the middle is holding up the roof. This is also an option you can use if you want to build your base inside of a mountain. You just need to find a spot with a thin rock roof rather than overhead mountain, because that's completely solid. It's perfect for keeping your base safe from drop pods and mortars, but not ideal for getting rid of high temperatures. I've also included a build that showcases the nutrient paste dispenser here, and how you can set that up to keep the raw ingredients cold in a freezer side while still dispensing food in a nice warm dining room. We're not going to use a nutrient paste dispenser in this colony because I'm going to explain butchering and cooking instead. But if you ever want to use the most efficient meal source in the game, paste makes a little bit of raw food go a very long way. Just be aware that your colonists won't exactly enjoy eating the mystery slot every day. The best part of it is that after setting up your freezer storage, you already have all of the knowledge you need to make a nutrient paste dispenser work. You just copy from the shelves, paste over the hoppers, tick it up to a higher priority, and it's done. It's super easy, right? What we want now for this freezer is to build an airlock. Personally, I like to make my freezer airlock multi-purpose by also using it as a room to butcher meat, so that's what we're about to make. We don't really need a very big footprint for this room at all, it just needs enough space to fit the butcher's table and allow clean access through. So let's drag a 5x4 box that leaves us with a 3x2 interior. Still using wood for now, we can fix that later. Let's just worry about getting all of our basics down and functioning first. If you're following my method of conduits under walls, don't forget to place those down too, and we can also put a wall light in this setup. The last thing we need is the butcher table. Make sure that the interaction spot is accessible as shown here. Once that's all been built, we can go about setting up our butcher table. But before we jump into the builds, let's quickly hit the big I button again and display some information about it. What we're interested in here is the offset to a stat called Cleanliness. We can see that it's a massive -15. If we'd placed a butcher's table in the same room as our stove, which would have made sense given that it's a kitchen, what you're going to end up finding is that colonists will be constantly developing food poisoning, and this is due to food being prepared in an unclean environment. This is why the airlock is great. It helps keep our freezer colder, and it keeps all the dirty work isolated to its own tiny room. It's time to set up our first work build then. Butchering is a nice easy one, and it lets us play with a few of the settings to dip our toe into the water, without being overwhelming. We can open up the Bills tab and select Add Bill. If we don't add any bills to a workstation, it won't do anything besides sit there and look pretty. You need to tell your colonists what they're doing basically every step of the way. So, we're picking Butcher Creature, and then we're hitting Details so that we can edit the settings of it. First big question, do we want this build to be done a certain number of times, until we have a certain number of things, or forever? For butchering, pretty simple, it's forever. If an animal corpse is available for butchering, we should be doing it. So let's set the option to do forever. We can see from the menu on the right that it shows what corpses we're allowing or denying for this process. Yes, if you wanted, you could butcher human corpses for meat and leather. Most colonists outside of cannibals or psychopaths are going to be pretty traumatized if you tell them to do this, so let's just leave it to animal corpses. The thing that we do want to change, however, is the ingredient radius. If we leave this as unlimited, the butcher has a chance to walk halfway across the map to grab corpses one by one, whereas it's going to be far more efficient if they're only grabbing bodies that have already been moved to the freezer. So let's drag that down to about 20 tiles or so. What you can see is a white circle expanding and contracting on the map as you do this. Anything inside that circle is what's going to be eligible for this build. That's all we need to do for now. You can see if you really wanted to that you can rename this build to whatever you'd like, or you could tell the worker to bring the resulting meat to a specific stockpile if you really needed to. That's why naming stockpiles may help. That way you'll know what you're actually telling them to drag it to, rather than just stockpile 1, 2, 3. With how we've already set up our stockpiles by using sensible cascading in terms of levels of priority, this can be safely left on best stockpile and it's going to work absolutely perfectly. With the airlock now in place, let's quickly look at what's going on in the temperature of our base. We can see that the outdoor temperature is a little bit warmer than our main storeroom, depending on the time of the day anyway. The freeze is nice and chilly and the airlock is also dropping down quite a bit. So why is the storeroom sometimes colder when it doesn't have a cooler place inside it? Well, wood isn't a great insulator, so some of the frosty air from the freezer is bleeding through the wall and causing our main storeroom to cool down. Even more is bleeding through the door into the airlock room, which is actually a good thing, because it means it now has an additional room that the heat needs to escape through before it's fighting the outdoor temperature directly. So you're likely to find that your freezer is having an easier time keeping the degrees down with that airlock in place. We can make the airlock even more effective and finish up our food setup by placing down an actual kitchen. I'm going to drag a nice easy 5x6 room here, connected to both the south wall of my freezer and the door leading into the airlock. Then we place down a door on the south side which leads out of the room. Again, I'm making sure I expand my conduits as I go. We can pop a wall lamp in here too, and we'll wait for the room to finish before we start work with the stove. Once the basic parts for the room are down, if we grab the room stats display and hover over this new room, we can see that it makes for pretty grim reading actually. The room is ugly and dirty because we still haven't placed any floors in this base. Now's the time to do it because it's actually going to start mattering. We know from going over the information on the butcher table that a negative to cleanliness and cooking is not a great combo. Regardless of how good our chef is, if we're making food in a dirty environment, it's always going to lead to a higher chance of getting people sick. Given that this colony is still very early days, it's unlikely that we even have a good chef yet, so the odds are pretty stacked against us if we don't treat food poisoning seriously. An illness spiral can be especially dangerous, as food poisoning is going to make colonists vomit, which then increases the likelihood of a dirty kitchen, which leads to more poisoned meals. You really don't want your entire colony walking and working more slowly as they're constantly fighting off foodborne illnesses. So we have a few options here, potentially more depending on if you were deconstructing stone structures for your construction experience. Wooden floors are very neutral in their stats, but they're flammable. So if we're using wooden floors and wooden walls, the chances of a room becoming a furnace are increasing exponentially, because it's likely going to spread faster than you can extinguish it. Concrete is nice and very cheap, but it's also ugly, so a colonist working or living in a room with a concrete floor is going to be pretty unhappy about their surroundings. Paved tiles are a nice neutral option that isn't a fire hazard. However, they're twice the price of concrete, and using steel for flooring is actually quite expensive. If you have some stone, you could place flagstone or tiles here instead. This is a great option as it's fireproof and it's using a material that's less important when compared to something like steel. The flagstone floor is very fast to place, neutral in its beauty, and it yields no materials when removed. Whereas tiles are pretty and will yield some of the stone if you deconstruct it later, but they also take about twice as long to build when compared to flagstone, or 10 times as long if you compare it to concrete. For now, I'm going to do a quick concrete pour. It's super cheap, and if we really wanted to, we could replace it later with steel or even sterile tiles to improve the cleanliness of the room. That's talking about pretty far in the future though, we're not rushing to make changes like that. So, pick your poison and get the dirt covered up. If you want to floor the rest of your base, now's a great time to do so. I quite like using paved tiles underneath my doors. It makes for a good separation between individual rooms and creates a clear boundary between the indoors and the outdoor terrain too. Don't forget the spots underneath your furniture when placing flooring as well. Your builder is hench enough to casually lift beds or a butcher table with one hand when placing a floor down, so you're not going to need to uninstall it to do it, but the spaces underneath furniture are still counting towards the room stats, even if you can't see it. Also, apologies to anyone that's now looking at their chimney and thinking they need to put floor underneath that barricade. The room itself doesn't necessarily matter, but I get that aesthetics are a thing. If you want to fix this, it's a good time to use that deconstruction tool. Select one of the walls that faces either north, east, south or west in this example, as corners were changed in patch 1.6 and will no longer grant you access to reach the tile inside of another room. Then press the deconstruct button or the hotkey X. You can force your builder to focus on doing this work first by selecting them and right clicking on the wall. You'll see the option to prioritise the deconstruction task. Once that's done, place down your floor of choice, select the builder again and force them to do it. Then do the same when you're walling your chimney back up. That way you can be sure that the vulnerability in your freezer was exposed for the shortest amount of time possible. Forcing work in this manner is fantastic if your builders or crafters seem to be doing every job except the one that you actually want them to do. You can even queue up multiple forced work priorities by holding down Shift when assigning the work. Make sure you're not holding it down for the first designation, otherwise they carry on with their original job. So you force them to do the job that you want, then hold Shift and select the other jobs that you want them to do afterwards. When our floors are done, it's time to build an electric stove. Make sure you don't pick the fueled one. Given that we've got power floating in our grid from burning wood at the generator, we don't want to be wasting wood by burning it in our stove as well. After placing this electric stove, we're also going to pop down a stool for it. Generally speaking, butchering is a pretty quick job that's performed fairly infrequently, whereas most other jobs, like cooking at the stove, are a little bit more time intensive. If a chef is performing work bills back to back, taking care of their comfort is going to help their mood throughout the day and avoid them experiencing a mental break. Just like in real life, Rimworld chefs don't appreciate doing an entire day of cooking without the odd 5 minutes to sit down or the occasional smoke break. Let's check a couple of stats on that stool that we've built here by pressing the I button. You might be picking up the vibe now that this button is something you should be hitting whenever you have a question about the game. There really isn't a lot that can't be explained or understood by taking a look at the information pages, so give these a quick once over before you jump on Reddit or the Steam discussions page. It'll probably answer the question that you have in the time it would have taken to start writing up a post. What we're looking at here is the comfort stat, and to cover a very general mechanic at the same time, quality modifiers. First off is comfort. 0.5 is the baseline comfort for a stall. It's a weird number, right? What exactly does 0.5 relate to in terms of comfort? Well, a piece of furniture with comfort 1 means it can fully satisfy a colonist's comfort need, so it might be easier to think of it like a percentage. Take out the decimal point, whack a percentage sign on the end. That's how far the furniture is capable of filling the need for comfort. So a stool at normal quality can bring the comfort bar right to the middle, meaning that colonist won't have a mood bonus for comfort, but they're also well out of the danger zone in terms of experiencing discomfort. Your stool might not be normal quality though. I'd suggest seeing a doctor if that's the case. It could be awful, poor, good, excellent, masterwork, or legendary instead. So what does quality do to an item? What quality changes is going to depend on what you're looking at, but it always follows the obvious rule of higher quality is better. So furniture will have a higher comfort value or be more beautiful, as well as having more hit points, so it's less likely to be destroyed if it's attacked. If it's a piece of clothing or armour, you can expect it to have higher protection values from different types of attacks and offer greater insulation from extreme hot or cold temperatures, whereas weapons are going to be more accurate or deal more damage. This bonus to stats is offset on all items by increasing their market value. Higher quality items are more expensive to keep around your base, which means that whilst it may be great that you've got all of the best equipment possible, your enemies know that your base is full of some very tasty loot opportunities, so they're going to throw larger threats your way to try and take it. Don't ask me how that logic also applies to things like fighting off a massive group of manhunting geese though. Sometimes we just need to accept that it's video game logic and that's how threats are balanced. If you can't tell at a glance what stats have been changed by quality, mousing over the item information will eventually show you a quality multiplier modifier that impacts the final value for the item. Unfortunately, the effect of quality is going to be different from stat to stat, so I can't give you a definitive number and say, for example, masterwork quality is always 150% bonus to anything. It's not that simple. You can know for definite that a masterwork quality revolver would always be better than a normal one, but because of the stats that masterwork is increasing for ranged weapons, accuracy, damage, armor penetration, you might find that some guns get a significantly bigger bonus from this quality modifier than others, so don't feel tied to using a better quality weapon just because it's better quality. A normal assault rifle will still do better than a masterwork revolver. Again, if in doubt about anything, open the info page, compare and contrast. Or if you're not bothered about the stats, use what you vibe with. A colonist might look great with that revolver to match a cowboy hat and duster. Right, let's wrap up this cooking chain anyway. For now, all we're going to worry about is making simple meals, so let's get them made in bulk. Making them in bulk takes just as many raw ingredients and just as much work as it would if we made them individually, but it saves us a fair bit of time walking back and forth to the freezer to keep gathering a new handful of ingredients every time. Now, with this bill, we're going to use do until we have X type of crafting. This can sometimes be the one that trips new players up. It's useful to learn how it works to automate production around your colony. We can see that when made in bulk, meals are produced in groups of 4, so keeping to multiples of 4 when inputting numbers for currently have an unpause at makes it easier to assign amounts that the bill is naturally going to land on. For now, I'm setting that we want to do this until we have 20 meals. Then we pause the bill when it's been satisfied, and unpause the bill when the meals in storage drop to 12. We could easily be telling our chef to make more than this too, now that our freezer is fully functional, and don't get too caught up in thinking that I've given you some kind of golden ratio. The numbers I'm using are just an example. What it means is that our cook will aim to make enough simple meals so that we have 20 in storage. We may hit more than that if, for example, another colonist grabs a meal while we're still cooking, so we have 19. We make 4 more, we end up on 23. The important thing is we are trying to hit at least that top number before we pause work on this bill and go and do something else. What we don't want from this though is the chef to stop cooking when they've made 20 meals and then let us completely run out of food before they start cooking again. So this bill unpauses when it notices that meals are hitting 12 in storage, meaning our chef should only need to do 2 more bulk cooking bills to refill our stockpile to the desired amount. Why don't we want this bill on do forever then, like we did with butchering? Firstly, we're not going to want to use simple meals forever, so using all of our raw resources on super basic food isn't great. Secondly, a lot of raw food items have a considerably longer shelf life than a cooked meal, so whilst everything is going into the freezer and staying fresh, that's all under the assumption that we never have a power cut, which is going to happen at some point because we have solar flare events that cut out electrical devices from time to time. It's much more dangerous to have all of our food spoiling if it's only on a short timer, whereas keeping some of our food raw means that we always have a reserve of ingredients if all the meals do spoil. It could be a really unfortunate series of events. Finally, let's talk about the ingredients that this meal is using. The default settings here are pretty good, we just need to lower the ingredient radius a bit to avoid running across the map. We're not going to include insect jelly because that's delicious to eat raw, and we don't want to use fertilised eggs because they're more likely to be useful if we let them grow up into the animal. We also don't want to put human or insect meat into our meals because they come with debuffs, the human one far more so in this case. So, how the hell did this tutorial take so long to just get the need for food covered? Well, look at what you've made so far. You learned how to make rooms, stockpiles, how priorities work. You've built a functional freezer, you've gained an understanding of temperature mechanics, you know the basics of setting up crafting bills, you've got beds for your colonists, they're perfectly happy with the recreation on offer, there's plants in the ground, electricity's fully functional around your base. As basic as all of this seems, you've made a fully operational colony right here. Don't get me wrong, these guys are not going to make any forward progress if they stay like this, but right now, every need they have is covered. That's your baseline. With this knowledge, you can apply it to everything. Anything that you want to build can be placed from the architect menu, just like you did with all of these parts. All of the workbenches use bills, just like the ones that you've already set up. Any further needs that your colony develops can be fulfilled by working out what it takes to satisfy it, following the chain back to the start, and building from there, just like we did when we placed a generator down at the very start to get a power grid going. Of course, there's still a fair few things in Rimworld that we haven't gotten into yet, so let's cover one of the big ones that probably came up while you're in the middle of building this little base: combat. Regardless of if you have naturally made it to this point of the video, or if you had to jump ahead to here because your base is under attack, chances are combat's the one part of the game that's going to make you panic a little bit, because nobody wants their colonists to get stabbed, shot, bitten or dead. First things first, let's equip our colonists. With the crash landed start, you are handed a revolver, a rifle and a knife. We want to make sure that these are going on the right people for the job and make the best use of them possible. Broadly speaking, I'm going to put the knife on the colonist who has the highest skill in melee, especially if they have a trait like tough, brawler or nimble. Then I'll equip the rifle on the colonist with the highest shooting skill, and I give the revolver to whoever's left. If it helps you, you can do what I do in quickly identifying your colonist combat skills. You can rearrange them on the bar at the top by holding right click on their portrait and dragging them left or right. I like to keep my ranged colonists to the left and my melee fighters to the right. That way I can more easily grab them in groups if needed. To control a colonist in combat, we need to draft them, which has the hotkey of R by default. This allows you to tell them where to move, who to attack, and it lets you choose certain actions from contextual menus, such as tending to someone's wounds, eating a meal, taking a drug. It's useful if you're dosing up and getting ready for a big fight. When multiple colonists are selected, you can drag and drop formations by holding the right mouse button down whilst telling them where to move. Don't forget that you can pause the game at any time that you need to as well. Combat does not have to be real time. You can easily micromanage as much or as little as you would like. So, what is the primary consideration with combat? Firstly, range is king. If you do not have to get into melee, you shouldn't. Melee is always dangerous. If you can take pop shots at your enemies and give them the old loop-de-loop around the map whilst doing so, you are more likely to make it out of a fight without a single injury. Of course, it's not always possible. Sometimes your enemies outrange you or have greater numbers, meaning they can overwhelm you or catch you out of position if you take too long running in circles. For that, we need to think about a defensible position. Fortunately, right now we're still in the early game, so the threat is likely manageable. This is working under the assumption that your first threat is either a man-hunting animal or a lone raider. But it might have been a predatory animal like a cougar that's hunting one of your colonists. For all of these fights, we're going to approach it the same. Our ranged are going to fire, and our melee is going to bide their time before locking up the target if needed to keep our ranged safe. Colonists using ranged weapons in Rimworld have an area around them that ignores the risk of friendly fire. This means you don't want to go charging in with your knife whilst also firing at that target with the revolver and rifle. You're likely going to end up hitting your own colonists in the back of the head. Have your ranged combatants stand near to each other and place your melee combatant in front of them, as if the ranged are shooting over their shoulder. This will keep your melee colonist safe from the risk of friendly fire and allow them to engage the approaching target first if necessary, without needing to walk around your firing line. This also allows your ranged combatants to keep shooting if your melee colonist has to engage, as a ranged combatant tied up in melee is unable to pull the trigger. This works both ways, of course. If you find that an enemy is packing a really nasty weapon, if you can bait them around a corner and have your melee fighter pounce on them, it completely locks them down, stops them using it against you. As you get further in the game, you're going to notice that enemy numbers ramp up dramatically in comparison to the size of your colony. It's no longer a case that you outnumber the enemy, now they try to zerg you down. Firstly, the angle of attack. If enemies can attack your base from all directions, they are going to. What you want is a defensive position that's reliable. The easiest way to make this happen is to wall off all avenues of attack, barring one. You can do this by building walls between natural rock formations, or make whatever kind of exterior compound you would like. Just make sure there is one clear path in and out of your base that's unobstructed. This is going to be the path that raiders want to take, because the AI looks at it and says, that's the path of least resistance. To ensure this is the case, make sure your perimeter walls are 2 tiles thick. Whilst we want our entrance to be unobstructed, we don't want it to be wide open, of course. This is going to be where we make our stand against the enemies. Now, there's loads of tutorials on making crazy broken kill boxes and trap mazes, but I'm not going to go over these. Others have done it and explained it far better than I could. It's not really how I play. How do I build my line? Well, we need a door that's usually held open, which is going to encourage raiders to path towards that entrance point. But we want that door to be accessible for our own colonists in case of man-hunting animals. Man-hunters only go for colonists if they see them. With a solid perimeter wall and closed doors, they wander outside of your base for a few days and then bugger off, which is great because it means any other threats that turn up during that time get eaten by the man-hunters. If you keep this door closed when raiders try to attack you, they lose the path of least resistance that they're looking for and begin doing odd things like hacking down your walls or attacking from multiple angles. What we want where possible is for them to always attack the same place in the same direction at a steady speed, so that we aren't getting flooded by their numbers advantage. Of course, there are raid types that try and bypass this strategy. Drop pods, breachers, but they'll have bypassed whatever other strategy you landed on anyway. You're always going to have to deal with them differently. Like I said at the top of the combat section, range is always king. If you can find a way to outrange your enemies and stop them from getting into position to where they're able to return fire on you, you're going to have a much easier time holding out against them. If you are forced into melee, there's one key thing to remember, which is how you should be holding the line. The easiest way to take enemies in melee is to make sure that you are fighting in an area that leans significantly towards your advantage. We can do that by forcing enemies down narrow corridors whilst holding a larger space at the end of it for ourselves. This allows 3 melee fighters to attack one of theirs at a time, with dogpiling being a dirty but very effective tactic, as it stops the enemy from being able to meaningfully use that number advantage against you. Remember how I said earlier that you don't want to place your doors in the corner? This is why. You can always use this tactic to hold doorways against manhunters or raiders, if you didn't have time to get your walls down too. Just make sure that your melee line doesn't rely solely on the 3 that are holding the space near the door. If one of them falls without another to replace that position, you might find that enemies start trying to sneak their way in and get around your defenders. The last thing you want to be doing though is trying to hold a doorway by standing in the doorway, as then you're the 1 against 3. Rimworld combat largely comes down to a positioning game. You'll mainly be denying your enemies their shots whenever you can, and the few times you do need to get into an actual brawl, you need to rely on outnumbering them by blocking the amount of bodies that they are able to get into combat at any given time. One of the key things to remember is that when entities are classed as being in combat, only one of them is allowed to occupy a tile at any given time. It's why you might sometimes see that large groups of enemies somehow explode outwards when they get near to your defences, or it might happen if a caravan on your tile gets caught up in combat. The better you can abuse this behaviour, the more successful you will be in combat scenarios. Obviously, things don't always go well in combat, so it's probably a good idea to start talking about medical treatment, and it's also not a bad place to go over taking prisoners and recruiting new colonists too, because you might have downed the first raider that tried to attack you, and now you'd like to have them join your side. That is, if they're any good, of course. If we're going to be combining these two topics, the first thing we need to do is build a prison for this potential recruit. Ideally, you want this room to only have a single door leading into it. The more doors a prison has, the faster inmates are going to attempt to escape. It might also be a good place to make the door out of steel rather than wood, as a prisoner going berserk is going to quite rapidly bash down a wooden door. Once we've got these prison walls down, we can place some beds inside the room and then select one of them. You see that we have some toggles on the gizmo bar at the bottom. If we tick one of the beds to change it over to being for prisoners, you can see that it changes the entire room across. You're going to want to keep these prisons pretty minimal, as in don't store things inside of the prison outside of maybe some emergency herbal medicine, so that they're easy to grab. If prisoners have access to your stockpiles, they will make use of the things contained within them, including weapons and armour. So hopefully this room also doesn't lead directly into your storeroom either, because an escaping prisoner is going to grab some gear on their way out, increasing the chances that one of your colonists gets hurt when trying to subdue them. Hopefully now we've got some kind of functional prison and somebody inside of it, or at least the idea of putting somebody inside it later. In base game, prisoners come in 2 varieties, unwaveringly loyal or normal. An unwaveringly loyal prisoner will never join you. You're unable to influence them. You'll see that on the menu for prisoner interactions with them, you don't even have the choice of attempting to lower their resistance or recruit them. The only things you can do are maintain, release, or execute. We will get around to what you could potentially do with an unwaveringly loyal prisoner in a little bit. If you have a potential recruit that didn't get this annoying loyalty, you'll see that you have settings to recruit or lower their resistance only. We're going to select recruit. If you pick lower resistance only, you'll bring them over to your way of thinking, but you never quite seal the deal, meaning they stay in prison waiting for you to say the word before they join you. All prisoners have a resistance number. This needs to be brought to 0 before they will join you, with some prisoners having a higher base number than others. Your wardens, colonists that are good socialites basically, are going to converse with prisoners and bring them meals. Initially, this is probably going to have minimal influence on that resistance number, as they're going to be in a low mood and have a very poor opinion of your warden. With more time and extended conversations, eventually it's going to have a greater impact on bringing that resistance down, until it reaches 0, and the target is then ready to be recruited. Once they are, that's it. You get yourself a new colonist and can put them straight to work. Just be aware that prisoners do still have needs and mood offsets, so whilst building recreation for them is unnecessary as they lose the recreation need, you might still want to build a table for them to eat at to avoid the debuff for eating without one, and you may also want to place some accessories for the prison beds, like end tables and a dresser, so that they get a larger amount of comfort when sleeping and they're in a better mood when waking up. Whilst it might seem counterintuitive, absolutely crushing the spirit of your prisoners only makes them more likely to snap. If their mental break happens to be violent, you might kill them in an attempt to stop their rampage, which isn't ideal because presumably you captured them because they had nice traits or stats. Of course, maybe you grabbed them because you didn't want them for those reasons. Let's move over to the medical tab, shall we? You'll see on the health tab in this scenario that our prisoner needs tending to, with some wounds that are bleeding. Bleeding wounds can be cuts, gunshots, or missing limbs, and then there are those that are still painful but not quite as life-threatening, things like burns, bruises, or cracked bones. Bleeds will always be treated as a priority wound, as pawns can easily die from significant blood loss, with certain body parts presenting significantly more dangerous bleeds, like being hit in the heart or neck. Bruises, on the other hand, are rarely lethal, but they cause a significant amount of pain, so they do still need tending, otherwise the patient is unlikely to be up and moving anytime soon. Tending a wound is going to increase the speed of its recovery. So for prisoners, we're not really that concerned if they're back up at full capacity super quickly. It's why we'll use herbal medicine on them, but keep the industrial tech medicine and glitter world for ourselves. Having a wounded pawn also lets us look at the stats shown in the health tab overview, and we can see how they're impacted by injuries and conditions. Pain is self-explanatory. The more pain the subject is in, the larger the mood debuff they experience, and extreme amounts of pain will cause the person to collapse and be unable to act. Wounds that cause large amounts of pain whilst doing relatively little damage, like burns, are great for dropping targets extremely quickly for this reason. Consciousness is a very important stat because it impacts basically everything that any colonist can do. An injured subject will have their consciousness lowered because of pain and any potential blood loss, which in turn lowers other combat related stats like moving and manipulation. If consciousness ever hits 0, that's death. Moving, of course, is going to tie directly into movement speed, but it can also help with things like melee dodge chance. Manipulation is a stat that catches almost everything. It's how dexterous and capable the colonist is with their arms and hands, so it's going to play into all types of combat as well as all types of work, barring social. Social is handled by stats like talking and hearing. Eating is going to determine how fast a colonist consumes their meals, and digestion, oddly, impacts how quickly someone can rest to restore their sleep need. Sight does quite a lot for combat offsets, but it also assists with basically all work types, so losing an eye is a pretty major debuff across the board, and eyes are very vulnerable to animal attacks. I swear it's all they ever go for. Breathing is going to negatively impact consciousness and movement if it's lowered, so asthma impacts more than just lungs. It makes the entire colonist weaker. Blood pumping is similar, with that impacting consciousness and movement. Finally, blood filtration is there to measure how well that person can fight off infections and diseases. If you ever want to see what a work stat is impacted by, let's say you were trying to make your researcher as efficient as possible, you can always check their information page. Find that value, which in this case is research speed, and then look at the health conditions that impact it. So here we can see that the final research speed results from our global work speed, our intelligence skill, our manipulation, and our sight, with 110% being the maximum offset that we could make use of. If you ever see that something says 100% is its maximum offset, that means it can't be improved further by increasing health stats. So if we take a look at the mining yield, That's only going to be improved by increasing the mining skill itself. It can never be pushed further by raising manipulation or sight. It could be lowered if that colonist was to lose a hand or an eye, because that would be bringing those stats down. I hope that makes sense. There's a whole lot of stats in the information page, and at times it can feel odd that a fully decked out colonist with all these fancy limbs installed isn't performing their job any better than a bog standard person. If it ever feels that way to you, have a quick look in here and see if it's even possible to buff the stat that you are trying to. It could just be that it's entirely down to that specific work's skill level. Anyway, back to talking about injuries. Certain wounds may become infected. From highest probability of infection to lowest, you have burns, frostbite, shreds from explosions, then cuts and scratches. Whilst treating a wound will lower the probability of an infection, poorly treated wounds can still become infected, and performing the tend in a dirty room increases the chance that an infection will occur. Infections are going to be the most likely health risk that you will face that uses the immunity gain mechanic. For an extremely straightforward explanation, it's a death race. You want immunity to hit 100% before the severity of the illness or infection hits 100%. Infections and illnesses are treated just like a wound, with a higher quality tend reducing the speed that the severity of the problem increases. The immunity gain speed can be improved by keeping the patient well fed and letting them get plenty of bed rest, rather than forcing them to just work through it. Those are your basic tend options, and none of them are really going to require much input on your part. Your doctors will naturally take care of problems like this as long as they have the medicine to do so. If you do run out of medicine, they will still do as best as they can without supplies, but it's going to make for pretty low quality tends and very slow recoveries. If this is the case and an infection has rapidly grown out of control, accelerating far beyond the immunity gain, you may have to consider some more drastic options, which is a nice way of showcasing the Operations tab and the bills that includes. This tab is where you can tell your doctors to install prosthetic limbs onto your colonists if they happen to lose a leg or a hand. Later on, you'll be able to replace limbs with improved bionics, or maybe even extremely rare architect parts that will greatly improve a colonist's movement, manipulation, or sight. Of course, you also have a few less than savoury options here. Provided the infection that you're fighting isn't in something critical, like the head, neck, or torso, you could always amputate the affected part as an emergency measure. After all, losing an entire colonist because their hand went all Ash from Evil Dead is wasteful, when you could just chop off the bad hand and give them a wooden one later. But whilst I've been showing you this operations list, you weren't paying any attention to that at all, were you? Because all you saw was harvest lung, kidney, liver and heart. Yes, if you really wanted to, you can quite easily turn Rimworld into a black market organ farming game. That unwaveringly loyal prisoner problem I talked about earlier, well, they're still kinda useful, because you can take one lung, one kidney, and then dealer's choice whatever else you fancy. But the liver and heart are the most valuable things. The target will, of course, die when you remove either of those parts, or if you decide to take both lungs or both kidneys. The medical system is, as I'm sure you can tell, quite expansive, giving you all kinds of options on what you want to do with your own colonists, as well as any unfortunate raiders that weren't quite killed in combat. It's well worth mentioning that doing stuff like this is a fantastic way to level up your doctors quickly, and you might want to, because one of the worst feelings in the game is when you try to install a new bionic limb onto one of your own colonists and botch the operation. It wastes the limb and it causes some horrific injuries to the patient in the process. So whilst it may seem a little bit barbaric, performing a few practice surgeries on less important targets lets you get your medical skill up above 10 or so, and then it's pretty viable. You can also do things like install and remove wooden limbs on prisoners repeatedly for a good chunk of experience every single day. Plus, as a cheeky little bonus, prisoners that don't have any legs can't escape, so you never need to worry about prison breaks if you're constantly reattaching then deattaching a prisoner's peg legs. Look, Rimworld's got some pretty grey areas in terms of morality, alright? And it's the easiest way to explain and showcase the medical system. Later in the game, you can get more advanced pieces of furniture which help with things like surgery success chance and medical 10 quality, the hospital bed, vitals monitor, and the sterile floor tiles, which is going to allow you to build a purpose-built hospital. You've likely seen by now that normal beds can be designated as a medical bed too, so if you wanted to make a very basic hospital for your colony, somewhere that the beds are right next to a medicine stockpile for example, you can do so. All of the tools are already in the box, you just need to use them. Of course, that quite nicely moves us into something we've not really covered yet. Research. How do we unlock these new things? Clicking a project on the Research tab and selecting Research will tell us that we need to build a research bench to begin work on it. So let's get one built and make a dedicated lab whilst we're at it. I'm going to make this lab 7x6 in size to get the ball rolling, with the intention being that later on, if I wanted to, I could put the upgraded bench and the support furniture here alongside it. Of course, you could go much bigger and make a huge research room with loads of tables, but given that we've only got a handful of colonists, you might want to keep it cheap and cheerful. Again, make sure we've got power down, lights on, and a floor in place. It's especially important in our lab because cleanliness impacts research speed. Make sure you remember that. A research bench is also definitely one of those structures that you want a chair to be placed at. It's the long hours to get a new technology research, so keeping your egghead as happy as possible is a great idea. As for what project I'm going to pick first, we're going to do psychoid brewing, as that lets us make psychoid tea, which also lets us set up a drug schedule so that our colonists can consume it every couple of days. It's a very handy way to learn that mechanic. Whilst this research is being performed, and depending on what the weather's doing on your map, we can select this bench to see the research speed factor. At best, with a simple bench, it's going to be 75%. It's going to be lower if the room is dirty, dark, and either too hot or too cold. Much like the third bowl of porridge, a lab needs to be just right to make the best progress. Given that you already know how to set up a cooler thanks to building a freezer, and heaters are just as simple as plonking one down in the room and telling it what minimum temperature you would like it to maintain, I'm going to leave it to your judgment if you think you need to build one for this room or not. Whilst that research is running though, provided that your researcher isn't the only builder of course, consider what else you could be getting along with around the colony during this time. Do you want to make some actual shelving for your storeroom right now and organise it a little bit better? Is it time to make colonists their own individual bedrooms with some additional furniture so that they can have a nice night's sleep? What about making an actual dining room that isn't too far from the kitchen, rather than having people eat in the middle of the storeroom? Creating an impressive room that is dedicated to dining or recreation for your colony will provide your colonists with a long-lasting mood bonus too. To make rooms like that more impressive, consider using things like plant pots or using any urns that you scavenge from the ruins on your map. You could even make an artist's bench if someone has the free time to carve sculptures for you. This might also be a really good time to turn some of the stone chunks on your map into stone blocks by building a stonecutter's table, which will then let you replace your wooden walls for something that isn't quite so flammable. Just make sure that you don't drop the roof on your builder's head by trying to replace all of the walls at once. Stone walls not only help by being immune to fire, they're also much harder for a raider to break through, and thanks to their increased HP, they regulate the room's temperature more efficiently as well. If you compare a purely wooden freezer to a stone freezer, the difference is pretty obvious. That's a whole lot of whatabouts to throw at you, and not much guidance here though. That's because you've already got all the knowledge you need to make any of these things in your own game. So how about we do something that I haven't quite covered yet, whilst we're waiting for this research to finish. Let's make a workshop. I'm going to build it bigger than I need right now, with the intention being that later down the line, there's probably other workstations that I can build in this room. For now, we're looking at placing a tailoring bench, which is going to help us cover a few more concepts: hunting, materials, armour, coverage, layering, and slightly more advanced build creation. It sounds like a lot, don't worry, this stuff's easy. First off, hunting. Hopefully you've got your work priorities set so that the colonists that have guns are the ones that are assigned to hunt. Whilst primarily it's a great source of meat, hunting is also a useful and extremely fast way of getting large amounts of leather which you can use to make basic clothing. As we're still early days in using pretty pants weapons, I'm going to hunt the animals that don't have a retaliation chance, so that I don't lose someone in a really stupid way. That's most likely going to mean that right now we're hunting things like deer, donkeys, alpaca, rams or boars. Ideally something big if we can, rather than hunting loads of squirrels, rabbits or rats, because we're going to need to get a hell of a lot of them to make even a pair of pants. Once our hunters have ran off and started to blind fire at animals for a few hours, we can take the time to look at what these materials actually do and how it matters. So open up the bills at our tailoring bench and let's have a quick look at the button-down shirt. When we open up the information page for it, we can see the default stats showing us a normal quality cloth button-down shirt. Of course, we're hunting, so chances are we're going to make it out of leather. We can use the change material icon in the top right to cycle between potential options, with things like plain leather, pigskin or camel hide likely being what our hunter is going to be out collecting. Well, once it's been butchered, anyway. You can see that each leather is having a slightly different impact on the armor values or insulation of this shirt, with all of them easily beating cloth. Cloth isn't really something we use for armor. It's more for furniture, carpets or medicine. So useful to have around, but we don't need thousands of it because we're not using it to gear up our colony. What are these values anyway? Sharp armor is protection from things like knives, claws and bullets. Blunt is going to protect you from maces, hammers and fists. Heat will help you avoid being burned by superheated air, or help a colonist that's been set on fire taking less ticks of damage while they try and extinguish themselves. Armour in Rimworld is annoyingly based on RNG. It rolls between 0 and 100 for any given hit. The higher your armour percentage, the better the chance that you will fully deflect it. Here's the math of it. If the random number is under half of your armour rating, you completely negate it. If the number is lower than the armour rating but above half of it, sharp damage is changed to blunt damage, any damage taken is reduced to half. If however the random number is greater than the armour percentage, it hits without any mitigation. This calculation is done every time an attack needs to pass through a new layer of armour too. That's kind of a lot. Let's talk about coverage and layers quickly, as that makes it much easier to understand with a practical example. The most straightforward comparison for coverage is to look at a t-shirt and a button-down shirt side by side. The button-down costs 5 more materials to make, but armour-wise it's identical. The only difference that we can see here is the insulation against the cold. But the button-down is also covering the neck and arms in addition to the torso and shoulders. It's simply a larger piece of clothing. What we can also see here is that it occupies the skin layer. So let's find something that has a different layer. The duster. Everyone loves the duster. You know why? This is worn on the outer layer and it covers the torso, neck, shoulders, arms and legs, which means we can wear this duster over the top of our shirt and even our pants, and it provides additional armour to all of those places. This is where the nice example comes into play. One colonist wearing a t-shirt and a duster, the other wearing a button-down and a duster. They both get shot in the right arm. The one wearing the t-shirt only gets to roll the dice on that RNG mitigation once, because it's only going to check against the duster, whereas the colonist wearing the duster and the button-down gets to make 2 attempts to stop that damage. Not only that, they may roll a partial save twice, so it could halve the damage and change it to blunt when it hits the duster, and then it could halve the halved damage when it hits the shirt, making for a really trivial hit. What you're gonna notice with the nice high value armors in Rimworld is that they typically occupy 2 layers, like early plate armor or even late game marine gear. They both take the outer and middle slot. This is a little bit deceptive, as that RNG mitigation only hits each item once. It doesn't roll twice because it occupies 2 layers, it can only check against each item of protection once. Though, it's unlikely that you're going to be beating a high quality suit of marine armour by wearing lots of different clothing layers anyway. It's just handy to know. Also, in Rimworld, your hands and feet are never protected. Shoes and gloves don't exist. Those parts are always vulnerable to attack unless you install bionic arms and legs, because bionic arms and legs kind of absorb all body parts, meaning that you don't have bionic hands, fingers, feet and toes to smash. The only thing that the enemy can target is your arm or leg, which is now safely tucked behind a full suit of armour. Just be aware that because the only thing they are able to hit is now the arm or leg, not all the sub pieces, that means that the damage is more likely to accumulate on that one body part, which means it's much easier to destroy it entirely in a fight. This game has some weirdness from time to time. Finally then, let's do a slightly more advanced crafting build. Without external mods, it can be a little bit tricky to make sure that all of your colonists have something to wear or to use in a fight, but it's not impossible. You do have a way of ensuring that you've always got a spare set of clothing and extra weapons on hand for any new joiners. For this example, we're going to pick a piece of clothing that we want to have available as a baseline piece of equipment. We're going to pick a duster because our colonists already landed wearing pants and shirts. So I'm going to set it as do until we have X. Then X is going to be 1. I don't want to count what's equipped. I don't want to count what's tainted. What we're going to do is tell it to ignore anything below 51% condition and anything lower than normal quality. Finally, we tick only allowed ingredients, pause when satisfied, and unpause should be set to 0. Pick whatever materials you would like to use for this. I'd suggest turning off cloth, all of the walls, and maybe not using light leather at this part of the game, as well as bringing the ingredient radius down again, avoid people crossing the map and all that jazz. So what does a build like this actually do? Firstly, we know from setting up our apparel assignment way back near the start of the video that our colonists should be unequipping clothing when it gets to that tattered status. So we don't want to count any clothing in our storage that might have been unequipped because it was below a 51% threshold. We also told our colonists not to wear awful or poor quality clothing. So again, we do not want to count that because anything that's low quality or tattered is something that we're intending to sell when a trader shows up. We don't want it to interfere with our crafting build. The aim of this build is to create a new, reasonable quality duster so that we're always going to have one spare in storage. If a colonist can make use of the duster, or if it's better than the one that they're currently wearing, they are automatically going to come and equip it thanks to the apparel policy earlier. If that means that no more viable dusters are in storage, it immediately tells our tailor to make a new one. But they're never intentionally going to make a huge stockpile of dusters that we aren't using. It's great. New joiners are always going to have a new outfit ready to go on the shelves, and we don't need to keep racks and racks of clothing that people aren't wearing. Weapons, fortunately, are much more straightforward. You simply select a colonist and right-click on the weapon that you want them to equip. They can't wield multiple at the same time, so once they have their weapon of choice, that's done. The condition of weapons doesn't matter. They don't lose hit points when they're carried, swung or fired, but you might find from time to time they get a little bit damaged if they've been dropped and left in the rain, or if someone was hurt by an explosion, as chances are they drop their weapon into the blast zone too. All of that's to say, a revolver on 1 HP does exactly the same as a revolver at full HP. Just be aware that when crafting your own weapons, melee and ranged follow slightly different rules. Ranged weapons are static in their stats and material costs, so the main bonus that you can apply to them comes from crafting quality, whereas a melee weapon has its stats impacted by both the material that you chose and the quality that it came out at. To check what the best material will be for your chosen weapon, you can always open up that handy dandy information screen on the weapon crafting build. And yes, I am going to continue to drill into you just how useful this screen is. From here on, you can change the material and see that for something like a Gladius, the steel variant is basically the baseline to work with, whereas a plasteel 1 pushes up the armor penetration and has a huge jump in DPS. Uranium does slightly better than steel, but not as much as plasteel did. However, if we look at what materials do to a mace instead, again, steel baseline, you notice that plasteel does a little bit better DPS, but it actually lowers armor penetration. Then if we swap to uranium, suddenly this mace is a beast. Steel is always going to be a safe option to craft your weapons out of. It gets the job done. However, the harder materials to find, like your uranium and plasteel, they've both got advantages to offer. Uranium works best for blunt weapons, and plasteel makes great sharp weapons. If you have enough of this material laying around spare, and you want to treat your melee fighter to something a little bit special, consider crafting them a weapon with the best stuff possible. If you're looking at this and wondering why you'd ever want to use blunt weapons when sharp weapons clearly hit for a higher amount of damage, remember that when we looked at the armour, sharp was far higher than blunt. It's much harder for an enemy to block a swing from a mace or a club, so you've got to consider if you want the potential to deal a big devastating swing with a plasteel longsword that might cut a man in half in just one blow, or if you'd rather use the reliable damage from a heavy smashy mace. It might not kill enemies in one shot, but it's far less likely to bounce off their armour. After all that waffling, I think it should be about time for our psychoid brewing research to be finished, right? Hopefully you've had the time to harvest some psychoid by this point too, if you chose to plant some. The tea itself is brewed at the stove, which is great because we don't need to build anything new to get this up and running immediately. Now, quick thing, 1 dose of psychoid tea is 10 silver, but each tea takes 4 psychoid leaves to make, which costs about 8 silver. So this is one of those things you might want to be a little bit careful about with using a do forever bill, because if you get through all those psychoid leaves, you're now sitting on a lot more money. I know it doesn't sound like a lot right now, but if you do this every single time you harvest your psychoid, it won't be long before that stockpile just keeps building up and up and up and up, and then a pretty big raid shows up on your doorstep to smash and grab your stash. I'd recommend using similar settings to that simple meals bill, but make sure that the bill for meals sits above tea on the stove. Bills are arranged in this menu by priority, so the higher the position of the bill, the sooner it gets completed, provided you've got the materials to do so, of course. It's far more important that you've always got food in the freezer rather than drugs. Let's quickly open up our drug policies list and see what we can do with this psychoid tea. The first and most important thing to do is hit the info page for the tea. You getting tired of hearing that yet? We can see that it provides the drinker with 40% recreation. Nice. It gives them a high that lasts for 0.3 of a day, so let's say 7 or 8 hours, as well as having a 2-day safe interval and a 0% chance of randomly overdosing. The last 2 are important. No chance of overdose means this drug is always going to be safe to consume without a massive health risk, and the 2-day safe interval means that as long as we're not exceeding 1 dose of this every 2 days, addiction will never be a problem. If we scroll down, we can see the bonuses that we get for drinking psychoid tea. It perks the colonist up a little bit, lowers pain, and reduces the rate that their sleep bar depletes. Not only that, they get a nice little mood boost whilst under its effects too. As long as they don't have the teetotal trait, don't subject a colonist who's teetotal to scheduled doses of drugs. The stuff at the bottom about addiction is helpful to know in terms of how the mechanic works. The minimum amount of tolerance is the tolerance build-up that a colonist would need to have obtained before they run the risk of potentially becoming addicted. If someone takes an extra dose here or there, it's not the end of the world, as we can see that tolerance gain per dose is only 3%. You'd need to drink 4 doses of tea back to back in order to push them above the minimum. From there, we can see that once they are in that danger zone of addiction, there's a 2% chance with every drink taken that they become addicted to psychite, which would then need them to drink it every 1.8 days to sustain that addiction, which is a cost of $5.50 a day. All in all, not bad. If you're going to play with stimulants in Rimworld, they can be incredibly powerful, but check the risks on this page first before you commit your entire colony to taking narcotics. they don't all play as nice as Psychite T. From there, we want to establish our policy for this then. We know that the frequency for a safe threshold is once every 2 days, so we set frequency every 2 days. Now, this part's up to you. You could have it so that colonists drink every 2 days, regardless of their mood or recreation stat. Alternatively, you could lower that mood threshold to, say, 35%. What this means is that if the colonist was already doing okay in terms of their mood and is unlikely to suffer any problems because of a mental break, you can keep the tea as more of a break glass in case of emergency option when their mood does dip to a more dangerous level, rather than them having blown their safe dose interval when they were feeling perfectly fine the day before. We've about covered everything now, without wanting to spoil the entire research tree for you, of course. One of the important bits that we haven't really mentioned yet is green energy and batteries, which feels like a pretty important one as you've likely burned through hundreds of wood at this point and maybe had to build a second generator or two. This is also probably the last part that you might build alongside of. From here on, most of the choices are going to come down to what do you want to do and what interests you the most. Training wheels are off now. You do what you want to do. There are quite a few power options in the game that we could use on this map. You could build watermill generators because we're right next to the river. You could also spend a long time unlocking geothermal generators, which gives you a big source of steady, free power. Or you could research batteries and solar panels, and then pair them up with your wind turbines to have a renewable energy grid. So I'm going to set that up really quickly so you can see how it works, but it might not fit into your existing design. Chances are by now, our bases are vastly different. First off, if we're going to be building all of this additional power infrastructure, we're going to need a lot of steel and components. Right now, we can only mine for components by digging out compact machinery, but later in the tech tree we unlock the ability to craft them ourselves. As for steel, we could smelt it from slag chunks or mine it from veins on the map. Later, we can acquire steel from underground deposits by combining the underground scanner to locate it and deep drills to extract it. So if you're running a little low on either of the materials, now's the time to assign some mining orders, if you hadn't already. Remember that you've always got the search function too. Rather than dragging a mine order from the Architect tab, let's select a piece of compact machinery. You see that you have the option to either mine it or mine vein. Hitting mine will extract the single piece that you've selected. However, hitting mine vein is going to automatically mark any connected pieces of compact machinery for mining after that piece has been extracted. You can see that there's a difference in the shape of the overlay that it leaves on the tile too. Mine vein makes it incredibly easy if you know that you want all of the resources without needing to go back and forth to check when it's been uncovered, or to save you dragging an entire box of mining orders over a mountain that results in getting you a bunch of stone that you weren't really bothered about. Of course, steel and components aren't the only things that you can find in mountains. You can also mine for plasteel, uranium, silver, gold, jade. If by some miracle you've got through all of the stone chunks on your map too and wanted some more granite for your walls, you could also mine rock chunks by digging at the mountain of that type. Just be aware that chunks aren't a guaranteed drop like resources from deposits. To start our power empire, we're going to need to build a room for our batteries. This doesn't need to be anything fancy. All you need to do is make sure that the batteries connect directly to the power grid. Unlike a workbench or a lamp, the little wires that you use to plug in your other devices won't be able to support the amount of wattage that the battery needs to function, so make sure your battery shed has conduits leading right up to it. You also want to make sure that these batteries are kept out of the rain too, as they do not appreciate getting wet and have a tendency to explode and discharge any stored power when exposed to moisture. One thing I do like to do when making a battery shed is ensure that there's a clear path for the colonists to walk on if they need to go in and out of the room. Batteries will break down from time to time and require a new component to fix them. Having a walkway in place so that your builder isn't having to awkwardly clamber over a bunch of batteries makes it much easier to perform repairs. You'll see that the batteries have a few stats in the lower information panel: how much they have stored, efficiency, self-discharging, and grid excess. It's a lot of words, but it's surprisingly straightforward. Batteries can store up to 600 watt days of power, which is why it's listed as WD rather than just W. If you're using renewable energy sources like wind and solar, your available power is understandably going to fluctuate based on the weather and time of day. So if you know that your entire base, for the sake of an easy example, consumes 1,800 watts of power every day, that means you need 3 fully charged batteries to run it purely off of battery power for 24 hours. Of course, that's an extreme example. That's assuming for whatever reason that you're not generating any other power at all for that entire day. In most cases, we'd expect our solar power to come back up during the daylight hours so that the batteries are actually only needed to support it overnight when it's dark, which means 3 fully charged batteries could sustain a base that consumes more than 1,800 watt days of power, provided they're being fully charged again before the next evening. This is what the efficiency stat is for. Batteries will store your daily grid excess at 50% efficiency. Now, using renewables, this fluctuates wildly, so it's very hard to get an exact number for. To make it really easy, we're going to go as if we had a generator setup that has 500 spare watts of power in our grid. So we store 250 watts of power over the course of that entire day. That means over all of our batteries too. Each individual battery isn't somehow gaining 250 watts of power when there was only 500 going spare. That just leaves self-discharging. Each battery isn't perfect. It loses 5 watts of its stored power every day, regardless of what you're doing with it. So if you aren't providing your batteries with at least a trickle charge, they do eventually deplete even if there aren't any devices connected to them. Now we're going to put down some solar panels and some wind turbines so that we can move away from using our wood generators. You'll see when placing a wind turbine that they have a large area to the front and a small area behind them. Both of these boxes need to be unobstructed for the turbine to work with any real kind of efficiency. Things like walls, mountains, trees, and large standing structures will block turbines. So keep these slightly outside of your base footprint so that you're not in risk of building into that space when you start expanding. You have a few options to keep this space nice and clear around your wind turbines. Firstly, you could use the auto cut feature. This works just like when you were setting up an animal pen. It makes sure that any trees are cleared on a daily basis, so there should never be any obstructions. Secondly, you could set up a grow zone in these areas. That way your planters are able to grow crops that won't disturb the turbines, while stopping trees from sprouting up too. Thirdly, you could throw some concrete over the whole area and never have to worry about plants ever again. All 3 are viable. One is slightly more of an eyesore, but it's very effective. If you're planning on using turbines too, make sure to get the best return on your investment by setting up another one at the opposite end of the larger zone, facing the other direction. That way their clearance perfectly overlaps and you're getting the best use of that airspace in terms of power generation. To push the space between them even further, you could go for the 4th option of how to utilise that clearance and place your solar panels inside of your wind farm. Solar panels have a low enough profile that they don't upset the turbines, and they do have quite a large footprint, so this combination can save you a good chunk of potentially wasted area, if you weren't planning to use that for farms anyway. With both of these renewables down, you now have a very reliable source of power generation during the day, and anything from a trickle charge to an ample supply overnight. All that's left to do is make sure you have enough batteries in your base for the dark hours, with there being enough excess power in the grid throughout the day to adequately charge them. Basically, if you find that your batteries are full but they can't keep everything running overnight, you need to build more batteries. If your batteries aren't charging enough to support your base overnight and you keep having blackouts, you need to build more power generation. There is one piece of equipment that you do have access to that's very hungry for power and is going to be quite useful over the winter months. So let's quickly talk about the Sunlamp now that we have a power grid that can potentially support it. Sunlamps are cheap in terms of materials and very easy to build, but they consume 2,900 watts of power whilst they're running. Fortunately, they automatically turn off overnight, so you don't need to run them 24/7. A sun lamp will allow you to make a greenhouse. You can see when placing it that it has an inner white radius and an outer yellow radius. Within that inner white radius, a light is considered to be 100%, which gives you the ability to achieve 100% light and have crops in a temperature controlled room. That means you'll be able to grow plants year round if you wanted to. Using greenhouses, whilst power intensive, is going to allow you to reliably cultivate crops with a very long growing time, keeping your growing zones safe from any roaming herbivores and also stopping raiders from setting fire to your fields. Whilst it might be a little bit overkill for the biome that we've landed in, as it has relatively mild winters and we can always hunt for food if required, it's extremely useful in places with bitingly cold temperatures. Plus, later on, if you decided that you wanted to research and build hydroponics to grow plants extremely quickly, an enclosed room is going to help keep your very expensive setup safe from raiders and allow that investment to work year round without issue. Of course, plants aren't the only way you can go to keep yourself fed over winter. You might want to ranch animals. Place down some grow zones for hay grass to help keep them fed and fatten them up for slaughter. If you wanted to start expanding your pens, you're going to need some livestock. You can either tame wild animals yourself or buy tamed animals from traders when they come to visit you. If you do want to tame the animals on your map, it's time to bring up that also useful information screen and check a couple of things. Firstly, we need to know their diet. To tame a wild animal, your animal handler is going to try and tempt them with food, so it's important to know the things that they will or won't eat. If you want to make sure that you've always got acceptable food for animals, you can set up a bill to make kibble at your butcher table. It just needs a bit of protein and some greens to be smushed together, with this being an exceptionally good use of hay, as it makes the nutrition that it offers go a really long way. Provided we have the right type of food, the next part is checking the minimum handling skill required. This determines if we're even able to make a taming attempt. Certain animals are naturally easier to tame, like donkeys, whereas more wary creatures, like deer, require significantly more skill to be successfully tamed. You also want to be careful with animals that have a revenge chance on a taming attempt. If your handler is unsuccessful in convincing the beastie, it might decide that they look more appetizing than the food they were presenting to it. Rimworld offers you a huge variety of animals to ranch too, with lots of them offering more resources than just simple meat and leather. You could keep chickens for eggs, cows for milk, muffalo for wool, boomalotes for chem fuel. That's assuming that you're keeping animals purely for ranching too. You could be taming wolves or bears to use in combat. Animals like this typically have a higher level of trainability. This unlocks extra checkboxes on the animal tab, allowing you to teach them over time how to guard, attack, rescue or haul. Once an animal has had enough successful lessons in a skill, they unlock it and they're able to help out even more around the colony. They protect your colonists in combat, they save downed allies by dragging them back to a medical bed, or they move resources around to the correct stockpile. You're also going to find that certain animals, like dogs and cats, will occasionally perform what's known as a nuzzle action. This makes colonists a little bit happier for a while. Animals can be really nice to have around your base. You just need to be careful about their potentially explosive population growth, which is where slaughtering and auto settings for it come into play. Slaughtering a tamed animal will always result in the highest possible yield of leather and meat. Whilst hunting is quick, you always lose some of the resources, even if you take the target down with a really clean shot and don't destroy any of its body parts. Whilst you can manually check the slaughter order on the animals tab, as well as things like sterilize or release, you're also able to automate slaughtering on an animal by animal basis to save on constant micromanagement every time there's a new birth. You're able to set how many adult males and adult females you would like to keep, with it being somewhat inadvisable to slaughter animals until they're fully mature, as their reduced size results in less meat and less leather. You can also make sure that pregnant animals and bonded animals are spared slaughter here too. This helps in avoiding mood debuffs on your animal handlers if you killed their best friend, and stunting your farm's growth by killing pregnant animals. As a rule, I would advise against only ever going down to one male, as that's somewhat flipping a coin on a disaster taking them out and leaving you without breeding stock. Equally, you likely don't want loads of fully grown male animals, because the females provide more resources and can continue to grow your farm. So sorry fellas, there's only room for 2 guys on this farm, it's the chopping block for the rest of you. Outside of ranching and farming, animals can also help with caravanning. They help your colonists carry more weight and increase the speed that they can travel on the world map. Some of the best animals for this are going to be horses, but donkeys, muffalo, dromedaries, even elephants make for great choices. So if you regularly do trade missions with other factions, or if you like to explore those quests that pop up in the world, it's well worth grabbing some to speed up your journeys. While setting up a caravan, you want to make sure that you've always got enough food for the trip there and back, with certain biomes allowing your skilled planters to forage for food as you travel. We live in a forest currently, meaning it's not as important to pack a lot of food on our caravan as they can pick berries as they go. However, if we wanted to travel across to the desert in the west, we can see that forageability drops down significantly. This is also reliant on time of year and climate. If it's freezing cold on your map, all of the plants will go dormant. That also happens on the world map too. As well as food, it's worth considering packing some sleeping bags on your caravan too. This can be done by making bedrolls at home and then using the uninstall button on them. Once you've finished uninstalling them and put them into storage, they can now be taken by your caravan and will provide more comfort and a better night's sleep during travel. Whatever else you want to take during a trip is entirely down to what you're going to go and do. If you're off to visit another town to do some trade, you might want to bring your silver with you and some goods that you've got in order to exchange them. If it's a world site that's likely going to involve some combat, make sure you're bringing some medicine and potentially some stimulants like go juice if you're expecting it to be dangerous. Maybe an extra bedroll or 2 on the off chance you grab a prisoner whilst you're there. You could even bring a mortar if you've got enough carry capacity, as well as the shells to fire from it of course, so that you can siege enemies before facing them directly. So let's go over static defences. Rimworld has a lot of options in security. Sandbags and barricades for cover, spike traps to catch enemies out as they try and hide behind a corner, IEDs to try and hit a lot of enemies as they approach your base, turrets that can help with base defense, and mortars that allow you to attack enemies at great distances. We're going to be keeping this super simple, as I don't want this section to be hammering you over the head with numbers and really specific interactions. You just need to know what stuff does and how it works. Almost all structures in the game have a value for cover effectiveness. Things like walls, trees, stone chunks, sandbags, barricades, they're the most obvious sources, but colonists can also duck behind tables and chairs too. If you ever wonder why enemy raiders casually stroll through empty fields to try and reach a stone chunk whilst you land shot after shot on them, it's because the AI is screaming at them to find the best source of nearby cover, which you can use to your advantage too, by baiting enemies to move from cover to cover by staying out of their range, letting you get some free shots off on them when they move to the next piece. You should also follow a similar logic though, whilst approaching it in a less simple-minded fashion. Colonists in the open are vulnerable, so make sure that you're tucking yourself behind a wall and leaning out to shoot, or ducking behind a sandbag where possible if you need to face the enemy head on. Don't let them have the luxury of sitting behind cover and continuing to shoot at you. Make it so that they have to move if they want to engage with you, and you have the better position. Traps, both spike and IED, work best when placed in areas that are magnets for high foot traffic. Open fields are unreliable, whereas raiders always try and hug walls and stick to corners, because, again, they offer the most cover. The main thing you need to be careful about when placing traps is that your own colonists still have an accessible path. If you make a really long corridor that's only 1 tile wide and fill it with traps, at some point one of your guys is going to have to walk down there, and whilst they have a better chance of avoiding traps, that chance isn't 0%. It's why I tend to use spike traps to the left and right of doorways when I'm working with a more outdoorsy style of base, because enemies will stack at doorways, but it leaves the central tile completely clear for my own colonists to exit through. Turrets may not be as powerful as you think. They are a great accompaniment to your own team, but they will not take raids down by themselves. Turrets also have a lovely habit of exploding once they've taken too much damage, so don't put them all in a big cluster, and don't stand right next to them with your own defensive line. Ideally, turrets should be distracting enemies from shooting at your colonists, whilst providing support fire, with the bulk of the damage output still coming from your dudes. Mortars are the last thing here, and your first encounter with them might be from a certain enemy raid turning up, rather than having actually built one yourself. If enemies do show up with a mortar, don't give them the time to get it set up and start pummeling your base. You need to get out there and throw some bullets their way so that they abandon their fortified position and move in to attack you. Siege raids are quite nice though, as you get to scavenge all the resources they sent once you've dealt with them. So you might want to let them finish building their mortars just so that you can steal them, and then take all the shells for yourself as well. If you want to build some mortars yourself, expect to get through quite a lot of resources. All the shells need to be manually crafted and loaded between shots. Of course, the huge upside of using a mortar is that you do not need to directly engage with an enemy force. If they are hanging out before attacking you, it gives you the option of absolutely pasting them with salvo after salvo of high explosive or incendiary rounds. It can make a pretty big difference in how difficult the base defense is if you've already turned a good third of them into red mist, with all the others sporting pretty horrific wounds and rapidly losing blood on the way to your kill box. The only other real thing to cover is trade beacons and a comms console. Everything else you can play with in the game is pretty much a take on the mechanics that we've already covered in some form. If you know how caravans work, you can figure out transport pods. Just like if you know how to make meals at the stove using bills, you can apply that knowledge to making charge rifles at a fabrication bench. It's all the same system, it just uses different resources for an alternative outcome. It doesn't need to be overcomplicated, and you can take as much time as you need to look at research projects and objects. Find the stuff that you like, find the stuff that you think's cool, give it a try. Once you've reached microelectronics, you unlock the ability to build trade beacons and a comms console. This is going to open up the ability to do orbital trading, as well as speak with the other factions to ask them for help or to request a trade caravan, provided that you've got good relations with them. Trade beacons have a pretty big area of effect. If you took my room size advice as gospel and didn't make anything larger than 13 by 13, you'll find that a trade beacon placed somewhere in the middle of the room is capable of covering every single tile inside. This area is going to allow anything that's stored on a shelf or held in a stockpile to be traded with passing orbital ships. They're things that are going to pop up on your comms console from time to time. So ideally, you're going to want to place one of these trade beacons in any room that you're using to stockpile materials or gear. Orbital traders have a much larger stock and far more silver on offer than a standard trader that turns up on your tile. So if you've decided to go the route of harvesting organs, or made a lot of psychoid tea, or anything harder, these are a great way to turn those goods into silver, which can then be spent on whatever else takes your fancy when the next exotic goods trader rolls into town. Of course, while that's all the mechanical basics covered, there's all kinds of weird and fun interactions you'll come to grips with over time. I'll give you a few to get started with. Firstly, dead raiders are going to add value to your tile. If you're taking the time to bury all of the enemies that you kill to try and avoid debuffs by walking past corpses all the time, what you're actually doing is hiding wealth underground that's going to be slowly increasing how many enemies the game decides to throw at you every time. The best way to get rid of corpses is to burn them, either at a crematorium or by placing a stockpile for them in a fireproof room. Then lob a Molotov in every so often to clear it out. Just make sure that you remove it from the home zone, otherwise your colonists will try to extinguish that fire. You'll find that you can quickly gain reputation with other factions by giving them gifts, either by handing it directly to their traders or visitors on your tile, or by sending them a gift in a transport pod. Now, certain traders come in with more wealth on their pack animals than it would take to fix the reputation damage caused by jumping them. So, if you really wanted to, you could open fire on a bunch of traders, steal all of their goods, and then send an apology package with all the stuff that you didn't actually want back to them in a transport pod. You can earn yourself a lot of goods this way in a very short time. Just be aware of how quickly it increases the threat that the game is also going to send your way. Another nice thing to remember with traders is that they are usually hostile to the same things that you are. This can provide great protection against man-hunting animals, pirate raids, Thrumbo taking revenge because you attacked them, or perhaps giving you fantastic cover if you chose to break open the ancient danger while they were on your map. If you blow open the wall from a safe distance and leg it behind the caravan, they'll go and deal with the big nasties for you. It's great if you want to open it up early and see what loot might be inside. Just be aware that the wealth of an ancient danger is a pretty big jump in a new colony, but it might also give you an opportunity to earn some new recruits depending if the ancients in there are incapacitated, or rescue someone from the caravan if they get downed. That'll earn you goodwill when they recover and leave your map. I do keep mentioning the danger of earning a lot of wealth early on, so what can you do if nobody wants to seem to take it off your hands? Maybe you've acquired a bunch of very expensive but tainted armour, bio-coded weapons that you can't equip, or thousands and thousands of stone blocks that you didn't intend to make and now you can't use them. You could always dump it by making a caravan. You select the things that you want to get rid of and then you drop them on the world map once the caravan sets off. Then you can send the caravan home, they'll reappear almost instantly, and all of those resources that were taking up space and inflating your wealth are no longer a problem. Obviously, it's better to throw stuff at another faction in a transport pod as a gift if you can, but that's not always a possibility, especially if you wanted to try a different starting scenario and picked tribal. They're not going to have things like electricity and pod launchers for a very long time. And for now, I'm going to leave it there. I've made rundown videos for all of the official DLC that the game has to offer. Those are a bit more numbers heavy, but they thoroughly explain any of the new mechanics that are added in. So if you feel that you've found your feet and decide it's time to add more content into your game, they're there to guide you every step of the way, both in making the right decision in terms of what to purchase and how to actually use it once it's installed. I hope that this video has helped in some way. Maybe it removed or helped you through analysis paralysis when starting a new game. Perhaps it let you focus on actually getting the ball rolling with your colony, so that now you're more eager to keep playing and see where it leads. I mean, for all I know, this could have just confirmed that, nope, game ain't for you. That's fine too, as long as you give it a decent shot rather than just writing it off at first glance. There's a lot of fun to be found in Rimworld and all kinds of stupid situations to get yourself into. So don't take it too seriously, try new things, change the difficulty if you need to, because, dude, it's a single player game. Who cares if you're not playing on the hardest settings? As long as you're vibing and enjoying the time that you're spending with it, it's all that matters. If you'd like to see what I'm working on and get insights into upcoming projects, it's all available to view on my Patreon page. All the posts there are totally free to read, but if you would like, you can support me in producing content like this for just £1 a month. It gets your name in the credits of these videos and it helps me to stay alive. Thanks for watching, folks. Wherever you are in the world, enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Take care.